We Didn't Do Anything Wrong, Hardly, by Roger Kuykendall. Recording by Craig Franklin.
I mean, it isn't like we swiped anything. We maybe borrowed a couple of things but gee, we put everything back like we found it pretty near. Even like the compressor we got from Stinky Brinker that his old man wasn't using and I traded my outboard motor for, my father made me trade back. But it was like Skinny said. You know Skinny Thompson. He's the one you guys keep calling the boy genius, but shucks, he's no... Well, yeah, it's like Skinny said. We didn't need an outboard motor, and we did need a compressor. You've got to have a compressor on a spaceship, everybody knows that. And that old compression chamber that old man, Mr. Fields, let us use didn't have a compressor. Sure, he said we could use it. Anyway, he said we could play with it, and Skinny said we were going to make a spaceship out of it, and he said go ahead. Well, no, he didn't say it exactly like that. Like he didn't take it serious, sort of. Anyway, it made a swell spaceship. It had 4 portholes on it, and an airlock, and real bunks in it, and lots of room for all that stuff that Skinny put in there. But it didn't have a compressor, and that's why... What stuff? Oh, you know, the stuff that Skinny put in there, like the radars he made out of a TV set, and the anti-gravity and the atomic power plant he invented to run it all with. He's awfully smart, Skinny is. But he's not like what you'd think of a genius. You know, he's not all the time using big words, and he doesn't look like a genius. We call him Skinny because he used to be skinny. But he isn't now. He's maybe small for his age, anyway smaller than me, and I'm the same age as he is. Of course, I'm big for my age, so that doesn't mean much, does it? Well, I guess Stinker Brinker started it. He's always riding Skinny about one thing or another, but Skinny never gets mad. And it's a good thing for Stinker, too. I saw Skinny clean up a bunch of 9th graders. Well, a couple of them anyway. They were saying... Well, I guess I won't tell you what they were saying. Anyway, Skinny used judo. I guess because that wasn't much of a fight. Anyway... Stinker said something about how he was going to be a rocket pilot when he grew up, and I told him that Skinny had told me that there wouldn't be any rockets, and that anti-gravity would be the thing as soon as it was invented. So Stinker said it never would be invented, and I said it would so, and he said it would not, and I said... Well, if you're going to keep interrupting me, how can I... Alright, anyway, Skinny broke into the argument and said that he could prove mathematically that anti-gravity was possible, and Stinker said, sure... he could, and Skinny said, sure he could, and Stinky said, sure he could, like that. Honestly, is that any way to argue? It sounds like 2 people agreeing, only Stinky keeps going, sure, like that, you know, and Stinky, what does he know about mathematics? He's had to take remedial arithmetic ever since... No, I don't understand how the anti-gravity works, Skinny told me. But it was something about meson flow and stuff like that, and I didn't understand. The atomic power plant made more sense. Where did we get the uranium? Gee, no, we couldn't afford uranium, so Skinny invented a hydrogen fusion plant. Anyone can make hydrogen. You just take zinc and sulfuric acid and deuterium. You mean like heavy hydrogen? No, Skinny said it would probably work better, but like I said, we couldn't afford anything fancy. As it was, Skinny had to pay $5 or $6 for that special square tubing in the anti-gravity, and the plastic space helmets we had cost us 98 cents each, and it cost $1.50 for the special tube that Skinny needed to make a TV set into a radar. You see, we didn't steal anything, really. It was mostly stuff that was just lying around, like the TV set was up in my attic, and the old refrigerator that Skinny used the parts to make the atomic power plant out of from. And then a lot of the stuff we already had, like the skin diving suits we'd made into spacesuits, and the vacuum pump that Skinny had already, and the generator. Sure, we did a lot of skin diving, but that was last summer. That's how we knew about old man Brinker's compressor that Stinky said was his, and I traded my outboard motor for, and had to trade back. And that's how we knew about Mr. Field's old compression chamber and all that. The rocket? Well, it worked on the same principle as the atomic power plant, only it doesn't work except in a vacuum, hardly. Of course, you don't need much of a rocket when you have anti-gravity. Everyone knows that. Well, anyway, that's how we built the spaceship. And believe me, it wasn't easy. I mean, with Stinky all the time bothering us and laughing at us. And I had to do a lot of lawn mowing to get money for the square tubing for the anti-gravity, the special tube for the radar, and my space helmet. Stinky called the space helmets kid stuff. He was always saying things like, "Say hello to the folks on Mars for me, and bring back a bottle of Canal number 5, and all like that, you know. Of course, they did look like kid stuff, I guess. We bought them at the 5 and dime, and they were meant for kids. Of course, when Skinny got through with them, they worked fine. We tested them in the airlock of the compression chamber when we got the compressor in. They tested out pretty good for half an hour. Then we tried them on in there. Well, it wasn't a complete vacuum, just 27 inches of mercury, but that was okay for a test. So anyway, we got ready to take off. Stinky was there to watch, of course. He was saying things like, "Farewell, oh brave pioneers," and stuff like that. I mean, it was enough to make you sick. He was standing there, laughing and singing something like "Up in the Air, Junior Birdman," but when we closed the airlock door, we couldn't hear him. Skinny started up the atomic power plant, and we could see Stinky laughing fit to kill. It takes a couple of minutes to warm up, you know, so Stinky started throwing rocks to attract our attention, and Skinny was scared that he'd crack a porthole or something, so he threw the switch, and we took off. Boy, you should have seen Stinky's face. I mean, you really should have seen it. One minute he was laughing, you know, and next minute he looked like a goldfish. I guess he always did look like a goldfish, but I mean, even more like then. And he was getting smaller and smaller because we had taken off. We were gone pretty near 6 hours, and it's a good thing my mum made me to take a lunch. Sure, I told her where we were going. Well, anyway, I told her we were maybe going to fly around the world in Skinny and my spaceship, or maybe go down to Carson's Pond. And she made me take a lunch, and made me promise I wouldn't go swimming alone. And I sure didn't. But we did go around the world 3 or 4 times. I lost count. Anyway, that's when we saw the satellite on radar, so Skinny pulled the spaceship over to it, and we got out and looked at it. The spacesuits worked fine too. Gosh, no, we didn't steal it or anything. Like Skinny said, it was just a menace to navigation, and the batteries were dead, and it wasn't working right anyway. So we tied it onto the spaceship and took it home. No, we had to tie it on top. It was too big to take inside with the antenna sticking out. Of course, we found out how to fold them later. Well, anyway, the next day, the Russians started squawking about a capitalist plot, and someone had to swipe their satellite. Gee, I mean, with all the satellites up there, who'd missed just one? So I got worried that they'd found out that we took it. Of course, I didn't need to worry, because Stinky told them all right, just like a tattletale. So anyway, after Skinny got the batteries recharged, we put it back. When we landed, there were hundreds of people standing there. And Mr. Anderson from the State Department, I guess you know the rest. Except Mr. Anderson started laughing when we told him, and he said it was the best joke on the Russians he had ever heard. I guess it is when you think about it. I mean, the Russians complaining about somebody swiping their satellite, and then the State Department answering a couple of kids borrowed it, but they put it back. One thing that bothers me, though, we didn't put it back exactly the way we found it. But I guess it doesn't matter. You see, when we put it back, we goofed a little. I mean, we put it back in the same orbit, more or less, but we got it going in the wrong direction.
Recording by Craig Franklin. Beyond Lies the Wub by Philip K. Dick. They had almost finished with the loading. Outside stood the Optus, his arms folded, his face sunk in gloom. Captain Franco walked leisurely down the gangplank, grinning. "What's the matter?" he said. "You're getting paid for all this." The Optus said nothing. He turned away, collecting his robes. The captain put a boot on the hem of the robe. "Just a minute, don't go off, I'm not finished." "Oh?" The optimist turned with dignity. "I'm going back to the village." He looked towards the animals and birds being driven up the gangplank into the spaceship. "I must organise new hunts." Franco lit a cigarette. "Why not? You people can go out into the veldt and track it all down again. But when we run out halfway between Mars and Earth..." The Optus went off, wordless. Franco joined the first mate at the bottom of the gangplank. "How's it coming?" he said. He looked at his watch. "We got a good bargain here." The mate glanced at him sourly. "How do you explain that?" "What's the matter with you? We need it more than they do." "I'll see you later, Captain." The mate threaded his way up the plank, between the long-legged Martian go-birds, into the ship. Franco watched him disappear. He was just starting up after him, up the plank towards the port, when he saw it. My God! He stood staring, his hands on his hips. Peterson was walking along the path, his face red, leading it by a string. "Sorry, Captain," he said, tugging at the string. Franco walked towards him. "What is it?" The wob stood sagging, its great body settling slowly. It was sitting down, its eyes half shut. A few flies buzzed about its flank, and it switched its tail. It sat. There was silence. "It's a wub," Peterson said. "I got it from a native for 50 cents. He said it was a very unusual animal, very respected." "This," Franco poked the great sloping side of the wob. "It's a pig. A huge, dirty pig." "Yes, sir, it's a pig. The natives call it a wub." "A huge pig. It must weigh 400 pounds. Franco grabbed a tuft of the rough hair. The wub gasped. Its eyes opened, small and moist. Then its great mouth twitched. A tear rolled down the wub's cheek and splashed on the floor. "Maybe it's good to eat," Peterson said nervously. "We'll soon find out," Franco said. The wub survived the takeoff, sound asleep in the hold of the ship. When they were out in space and everything was running smoothly, Captain Franco bade his men fetch the wub upstairs so that he might perceive what manner of beast it was. The wub grunted and wheezed, squeezing up the passageway. "Come on," Jones grated, pulling at the rope. The wub twisted, rubbing its skin off on the smooth chrome walls. It burst into the anteroom, tumbling down in a heap. The men leapt up. "Good Lord," French said. "What is it?" "Peterson says it's a wub," Jones said. "It belongs to him." He kicked at the wub. The wub stood up, unsteadily, panting. "What's the matter with it?" French came over. "Is it going to be sick?" They watched. The wub rolled its eyes mournfully. It gazed around at the men. "I think it's thirsty," Peterson said. He went to get some water. French shook his head. "No wonder we had so much trouble taking off. I had to reset all my ballast calculations." Peterson came back with water. The wub began to lap gratefully, splashing the men. Captain Franco appeared at the door. "Let's have a look at it." He advanced, squinting critically. "You got this for 50 cents?" "Yes, sir," Peterson said. "It eats almost anything. I fed it on grain and it liked that, and then potatoes and mash, and scraps from the table, and milk. It seemed to enjoy eating. After it eats, it lies down and goes to sleep." "I see," Captain Franco said. "Now as to its taste, that's the real question. I doubt if there's much point in fattening it up any more. It seems fat enough to me already. Where's the cook? I want him here. I want to find out." The wub stopped lapping and looked up at the captain. "Really, Captain," the wub said, "I suggest we talk of other matters." The room was silent. "What was that?" Franco said. "Just now?" "The wub, sir," Peterson said. "It spoke." They all looked at the wub. "What did it say? What did it say?" "It suggested we talk about other things." Franco walked towards the wub. He went all around it, examining it from every side. Then he came back over and stood with the men. "I wonder if there's a native inside it," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe we should open it up and have a look." "Oh, goodness," the wub cried. "Is that all you people can think of? Killing and cutting?" Franco clenched his fists. "Come out of there, whoever you are. Come out." Nothing stirred. The men stood together, their faces blank, staring at the wub. The wub swished its tail. It belched slowly. "Oh, beg your pardon," the wub said. I don't think there's anyone in there," Jones said in a low voice. They all looked at each other. The cook came in. "You wanted me, Captain," he said. "What's this thing?" "This is a wub," Franco said. "It's to be eaten. Will you measure it and figure out—" "I think we should have a talk," the wub said. "I'd like to discuss this with you, Captain, if I might. I can see that you and I do not agree on some basic issues." The captain took a long time to answer. The wub waited good-naturedly, licking the water from its jowls. "Come into my office," the captain said at last. He turned and walked out of the room. The wub rose and padded after him. The men watched it go. They heard it climbing the stairs. "I wonder what the outcome will be," the cook said. "Well, I'll be in the kitchen. Let me know as soon as you're here." "Sure," Jones said. "Sure." The wub eased itself down in the corner with a sigh. "You must forgive me," it said. "I'm afraid I'm addicted to various forms of relaxation. When one is as large as I—" The captain nodded impatiently. He sat down at his desk and folded his arms. "All right," he said. "Let's get started. You're a wub. Is that correct?" The wub shrugged. "I suppose so. That's what they call us, the natives, I mean. We have our own term." "And you speak English? You've been in contact with Earthmen before?" "No." "Then how do you do it?" "Speak English? Am I speaking English? I'm not conscious of speaking anything in particular. I examined your mind." "My mind?" "I studied the contents, especially the semantic warehouse, as I refer to it." "I see," the captain said. "Telepathy. Of course." "We're a very old race," the wub said. "Very old and very ponderous. It's difficult for us to move around. You can appreciate that anything so slow and heavy would be at the mercy of more agile forms of life. There was no use in our relying on physical defences. How could we win? Too heavy to run, too soft to fight, too good-natured to hunt for game." "How do you live?" "Plants, vegetables. We can eat almost anything. We're very Catholic. Tolerant, eclectic, Catholic. We live and let live. That's how we've gotten along." The wub eyed the captain.
"That's why I so violently objected to this business about having me boiled. I could see the image in your mind. Most of me in the frozen food locker, some of me in the kettle. A bit for your pet cat."
"So you read minds," the captain said. "How interesting. Anything else? I mean, what else can you do along those lines?"
"A few odds and ends," the wub said absently, staring around the room. "A nice apartment you have here, Captain. You keep it quite neat. I respect life forms that are tidy. Some Martian birds are quite tidy. They throw things out of their nests and sweep them."
"Indeed," the captain nodded. "But to get back to the problem—"
"Oh, quite so. You spoke of dining on me. The taste, I'm told, is quite good, a little fatty but tender. But how could any lasting contact be established between your people and mine if you resort to such barbaric attitudes?" "Eat me? Rather, you should discuss questions with me. Philosophy, the arts."
The captain stood up. "Philosophy. It might interest you to know that we will be hard put to find something to eat for the next month. An unfortunate spoilage."
"I know," the wub nodded, "but wouldn't it be more in accord with your principles of democracy if we all drew straws, or something along that line? After all, democracy is to protect the minority from such infringements. Now, if each of us casts one vote—"
The captain walked to the door. "Nuts to you," he said. He opened the door. He opened his mouth. He stood frozen, his mouth wide, his eyes staring, his fingers still on the knob. The wub watched him. Presently it padded out of the room. Edging past the captain, it went down the hall, deep in meditation. The room was quiet.
"So you see," the wub said, "we have a common myth. Your mind contains much familiar myths, symbols. Ishtar, Odysseus."
Peterson sat silently, staring at the floor. He shifted in his chair.
"Go on," he said. "Please go on." "I find in your Odysseus a figure common to the mythology of most self-conscious races. As I interpret it, Odysseus wanders as an individual aware of himself as such. This is the idea of separation from family and country, the process of individuation."
"But Odysseus returns to his home." Peterson looked out of the port window at the stars, endless stars, burning intently in the empty universe. "Finally he goes home."
"Or as most all creators, the moment of separation is a temporary period, a brief journey of the soul. It begins, it ends. The wanderer returns to land and race."
The door opened. The wub stopped, turning its great head. Captain Franco came into the room. The men behind him. They hesitated at the door.
Are you all right? French said. Do you mean me? Patterson said, surprised. Why me? Franco lowered his gun. Come over here, he said to Peterson. Get up and come here. There was silence. Go ahead, the wub said. It doesn't matter. Peterson stood up. What for? It's an order. Peterson walked to the door. French caught his arm. What's going on? Peterson wrenched loose. What's the matter with you? Captain Franco moved towards the wub. The wub looked up from where it lay in the corner, pressed against the wall. It's interesting, the wub said, that you're obsessed with the idea of eating me. I wonder why. Get up, Franco said. If you wish. The wub rose, grunting. Be patient. It is difficult for me. It stood, gasping, its tongue lolling foolishly. Shoot it now, French said. For God's sake, Peterson exclaimed. Jones turned to him quickly, his eyes grey with fear. You didn't see him, like a statue, standing there, his mouth open. If we hadn't come down, he'd still be there. Who? The captain? Peterson stared around. But he's all right now. They looked at the wub, standing in the middle of the room, its great chest rising and falling. Come on, Franco said. Out the way. The men pulled aside towards the door. You're quite afraid, aren't you? The wub said. Have I done anything to you? I'm against the idea of hurting. All I've done is try to protect myself. Can you expect me to rush eagerly to my death? I'm a sensible being like yourself. I was curious to see your ship, learn about you. I suggested to the native... The gun jerked. See, Franco said. I thought so. The wub settled down, panting. It put its paw out, pulling its tail around it. It's very warm, the wub said. I understand that we're close to the jets, atomic power. You have done many wonderful things with it. Technically, apparently, your scientific hierarchy is not equipped to solve moral, ethical... Franco turned to the men, crowding behind him, wide-eyed and silent. I'll do it. You can watch. French nodded. Try to hit the brain. It's no good for eating. Don't hit the chest if the ribcage shatters. We'll have to pick bones out. Listen, Peterson said, licking his lips. Has it done anything? What harm has it done? I'm asking you, and anyhow it's still mine. You've no right to shoot it. It doesn't belong to you. Franco raised his gun. I'm going out, Jones said, his face white and sick. I don't want to see it. Me too, French said. The men straggled out, murmuring. Peterson lingered at the door. It was talking to me about myths, he said. It wouldn't hurt anyone. He went outside. Franco walked towards the wub. The wub looked up slowly. It swallowed. A very foolish thing, it said. I'm sorry that you didn't want to do it. There was a parable that your saviour related. It stopped, staring at the gun. Can you look me in the eye and do it? The wub said. Can you do that? The captain gazed down. I can look you in the eye, he said. Back on the farm we had hogs. Dirty razorback hogs. I can do it. Staring down at the wub, into the gleaming moist eyes, he pressed the trigger. The taste was excellent. They sat glumly around the table, some of them hardly eating at all. The only one who seemed to be enjoying himself was Captain Franco. More, he said, looking round. More, and some wine, perhaps. Not me, French said. I think I'll go back to the chart room. Me too. Jones stood up, pushing his chair back. I'll see you later. The captain watched them go. Some of the others excused themselves. What do you suppose the matter is? The captain said. He turned to Peterson. Peterson sat staring down at his plate, at the potatoes, the green peas, and at the thick slab of tender, warm meat. He opened his mouth. No sound came. The captain put his hand on Peterson's shoulder. It's only organic matter now, he said. The life essence is gone. He ate, spooning up the gravy with some bread. I myself love to eat. It's one of the greatest things a living creature can enjoy. Eating, resting, meditation, discussing things. Peterson nodded. The two men got up and went out. The captain drank some water and sighed. Well, he said, I must say that this was a very enjoyable meal. All the reports I've heard were quite true. The taste of wub, very fine, but I was prevented from enjoying this pleasure in times past. He dabbed at his lips with his napkin and leant back in his chair.
Peterson stared dejectedly at the table. The captain watched him intently. He leant over. "Come, come," he said. "Cheer up. Let's discuss things." He smiled. "As I was saying before," I was interrupted, "the role of Odysseus in the myths." Peterson jerked up, staring. "To go on," the captain said, "Odysseus, as I understand him—"
The Eyes Have It. Philip K. Dick. It was quite by accident I discovered this incredible invasion of Earth by life forms from another planet. As yet, I haven't done anything about it. I can't think of anything to do. I wrote to the government and they sent back a pamphlet on the repair and maintenance of frame houses. Anyhow, the whole thing is known. I'm not the first to discover it. Maybe it's even under control. I was sitting in my easy chair, idly turning the pages of a paperback book someone had left on the bus, when I came across the reference that first put me on the trail. For a moment I didn't respond. It took some time for the full import to sink in. After I'd comprehended, it seemed odd I hadn't noticed it right away. The reference was clearly to a non-human species of incredible properties, not indigenous to Earth. A species, I hastened to point out, customarily masquerading as ordinary human beings. Their disguise, however, became transparent in the face of the following observations by the author. It was at once obvious the author knew everything. Knew everything, and was taking it in his stride. The line, and I tremble remembering it even now, read, "His eyes slowly roved about the room. Vague chills assailed me. I tried to picture the eyes. Did they roll like dimes? The passage indicated not. They seemed to move through the air, not over the surface. Rather rapidly, apparently. No one in the story was surprised. That's what tipped me off. No sign of amazement at such an outrageous thing. Later the matter was amplified. His eyes moved from person to person. There it was in a nutshell. The eyes had clearly come apart from the rest of him, and were on their own. My heart pounded, and my breath choked in my windpipe. I had stumbled on an accidental mention of a totally unfamiliar race, obviously non-terrestrial. Yet to the characters in the book it was perfectly natural, which suggested that they belonged to the same species. And the author? A slow suspicion burned in my mind. The author was taking it rather too easily in his stride. Evidently he felt this was quite a usual thing. He made absolutely no attempt to conceal his knowledge. The story continued. Presently, his eyes fastened on Yulia. Yulia, being a lady, had at least the breeding to feel indignant. She is described as blushing and knitting her brows angrily. At this I sighed with relief. They weren't all non-terrestrials. The narrative continues. Slowly, calmly, his eyes examined every inch of her. Great Scott! But here the girl turned and stomped off, and the matter ended. I lay back in my chair, gasping with horror. My wife and family regarded me in wonder. "What's wrong, dear?" my wife asked. I couldn't tell her. Knowledge like this was too much for the ordinary run-of-the-mill person. I had to keep it to myself. "Nothing," I gasped. I leaped up, snatched the book, and hurried out of the room. In the garage, I continued reading. There was more. Trembling, I read the next revealing passage. He put his arm around Julia. Presently she asked him if he would remove his arm. He immediately did so, with a smile. It's not said what was done with the arm after the fellow had removed it. Maybe it was left standing upright in the corner. Maybe it was thrown away. I don't care. In any case, the full meaning was there, staring me right in the face. Here was a race of creatures capable of removing portions of their anatomy at will. Eyes, arms, and maybe more, without batting an eyelash. My knowledge of biology came in handy at this point. Obviously, they were simple beings, unicellular, some sort of primitive single-celled things, being no more developed than starfish. Starfish can do the same thing, you know. I read on, and came to this incredible revelation, tossed off coolly by the author, without the faintest tremor. Outside the movie theater, we split up. Part of us went inside, part over to the cafe for dinner. Binary fission, obviously, splitting in half and forming two entities. Probably each lower half went to the cafe, it being farther, and the upper halves to the movies. I read on, hands shaking. I had really stumbled onto something here. My mind reeled as I made out this passage. I'm afraid there's no doubt about it. Poor Bibney has lost his head again. Which was followed by, and Bob says he has utterly no guts. Yet Bibney got around as well as the next person. The next person, however, was just as strange. He was soon described as totally lacking in brains. There was no doubt of the thing in the next passage. Julia, whom I had thought to be the one normal person, reveals herself as also being an alien life form similar to the rest. Quite deliberately, Julia had given her heart to the young man. It didn't relate what the final disposition of the organ was, but I didn't really care. It was evident Julia had gone right on living in her usual manner, like all the others in the book, without heart, arms, eyes, brains, viscera, dividing up in two when the occasion demanded, without a qualm. Thereupon she gave him her hand. I sickened. The rascal now had her hand, as well as her heart. I shudder to think what he's done with them by this time. He took her arm. Not content to wait, he had to start dismantling her on his own. Flushing crimson, I slammed the book shut and leaped to my feet. But not in time to escape one last reference to those carefree bits of anatomy whose travels had originally thrown me on the track. Her eyes followed him all the way down the road and across the meadow. I rushed from the garage and back inside the warm house, as if the accursed things were following me. My wife and children were playing Monopoly in the kitchen. I joined them and played with frantic fervor, brow feverish, teeth chattering. I had enough of the thing. I want to hear no more about it. Let them come on. Let them invade Earth. I don't want to get mixed up in it. I have absolutely no stomach for it.
Invasion by A. Bertram Chandler. Recording by Dan Grzinski. For generations they had wandered about the universe looking for a planet on which to settle, and now at long last they seemed to have found a suitable home. Rogerez and Suzette were in their tiny cabin about to retire when the bulkhead speaker coughed twice and then began to talk in a crisp, authoritative voice. "This is the captain speaking," it said. "The Department of Astrophysics has just informed me that the star that we are approaching has a family of 10 planets, as well as many satellites and planetoids. It is possible that our voyage is over. In any case, we have been ordered by the Commodore to make the preliminary investigations. If our findings are hopeful, the main fleet will be diverted to this system. All departmental heads will report at once to control. That is all." Rogerez, who was halfway out of his trunks, pulled them on again. He got back into the shirt that carried the silver-crossed quill pens on its epaulets. He slid his feet into his sandals. Suzette sat on the bunk and watched him. Her thin, fine-featured face was thoughtful and serious under the pale yellow hair. "Rog," she said, "do you think that this is the real thing this time?" "It could be," he said. "It could be." She smiled faintly. "But you're the chronicler, and you keep the records, and you have access to the records of the chroniclers before you. You could tell me just how many sterile balls of rock or mud or water we've investigated since the beginning of the exile." "I could," he said. "I advise you, Sue, not to get any false hopes." "But the captain said that it was possible that our voyage was over," she said. "What will it be like to live on the surface of a planet, with room to stretch? What will it be like to have all the food we want instead of rations? All the water we want? What will it be like to be a real gardener? A real farmer, not a biochemist dabbling with seeds and shoots in tanks full of chemicals? What will it be like to be able to have children when we want to, not when some damn committee decides it's our turn to be parents? I hope, he said, that you find out, that we find out, but I must get along to control. One departmental head in the family is one too many, she said, smiling. I wish that you could stay with me to hear the news as it's released. So do I, he said. He kissed her briefly, opened the door, and almost ran out into the alleyway. He was the last to reach control. All the others were already there. Captain Maris, Kane, the chief officer, Blish and Cat, the two chief engineers, Crandall, the communications officer, Deal, who commanded the ground forces, Hain, the surgeon, Pamel, the biochemist, Claver, the purser, Keene, the astrophysicist. Rogerez stood in the doorway looking at them, at the men and women who were the rulers of this little man-made world. He looked beyond them to the banked instruments and controls, to the big screens upon which the stars were, to the layman, meaningless swirls and eddies of light against the blackness. He tried to get the feel of the occasion, began to toy with the phrases that he would use when writing his official account. "Sit down, man," snapped Captain Maris. "Don't interrupt his train of thought, sir," said Pamel cattily. "Who knows what beautiful purple prose is running through his mind?" Rogerez glared at her, but said nothing. After all, she was Susette's chief, and could make life hard for her. He took his seat at the foot of the long conference table. It's been worn shiny, he thought, by the elbows of generations. It's old, and the ship is old, and we are growing old with her. Will there never be an end to this voyaging? "Keen," said the captain, "tell us of your findings." "With your permission," said the astrophysicist. "The interstellar drive was shut down and observations made. The 10th, 9th, 8th, 7th, 6th, and 5th planets seem to be utterly incapable of supporting life as we know it. It would be barely possible to establish a colony on the 4th planet. We have not yet been able to decide whether or not the 2nd planet is suitable. The 1st planet would be most unsuitable." "Come to the point, man," said Colonel Deal impatiently. "On my own time, Deal," replied Keene. After the preliminary observations, our attention was concentrated upon the 3rd planet. Its mass is almost identical with that of the home world. So is the relative distribution of land and water. The same may be said for atmospheric density and composition. "Is it inhabited?" asked Deal. "There is life," replied the scientist. "Pamel will bear me out on that." "Is there intelligent life?" asked the soldier. "That does not concern us yet, Deal," said Captain Maris. "My instructions from the Commodore are to make the preliminary survey from a safe orbit. No landing is to be attempted until the arrival of the main fleet. If there is intelligent life, we shall not strike until we are ready." "Need there be war, Captain?" asked Hain. "Might it not be possible to establish friendly relations with the natives?" "Was it possible," asked Maris, "when the Glormingen landed on our home world?" "Between different races, there is only one possible state of affairs: war. Our world was taken from us by force. We shall take a new world by force." "I am ready," said Deal quietly. He looked around the table, a small, hard smile on his hard face. "He sees us all carrying guns, manning his artillery," thought Rogerez. After years of playing at soldiers, of studying strategy and tactics, he sees a chance of achieving what he thinks is his proper place in the scheme of things. "Cat," asked the captain, "how are your rockets?" "Ready, Captain," replied the reaction engineer. "They are always ready. My fuel tanks were refilled, as you know, only 20 years ago. The only consumption since then has been for the annual tests. Clever. In the unlikely event of our being ordered to send down a landing party before the arrival of the main fleet, how are your boat provisions? All boats are fully stocked, said the purser, as always. She looks, thought Rogerez, like a plump, competent housewife in the old stories. And that, with any luck at all, is what she will be soon, with her own little home to worry about, and not a ship. Rogerez, Maris went on, I suppose that your records are up to date? They are, sir. Then get them transmitted to the flagship for recording, and make it, from now on, a half-daily routine. Crandall, is all your equipment in good order? It is, Captain. Keep it so. The Commodore must be kept informed of everything. Everything. How much can we tell the people, Captain? Asked Claver. I realize the dangers of raising false hopes, but there has been considerable despondency of late. You can tell them, said Maris, that we have found our new world. You can tell them, too, that we may have to fight for it. We shall have to fight, said Rogerez. Put me in the picture, said Suzette. Nobody ever tells us anything in hydroponics. That bitch Pamela knows what's going on, but it'd break her heart to pass on information. What's the use of having a husband who's chronicler if I can't get inside information? This is inside information, said Rogerez. For some reason, the old man's decided to keep it secret. This is rather too big for him to handle, and he's waiting for instructions from the Commodore. As you know, we're in an orbit around the third planet. It's all that astrophysics said it was. Mass, atmosphere, climate, and all the rest just right. But it's inhabited. We can see the city lights gleaming from the night hemisphere. Crandall has been able to pick up what seem to be radio broadcasts. Voices talking in some odd language. Weird music. This much we know for certain. These people have electricity, and they have radio. It's fairly certain that they haven't spaceflight. There are no signs of colonization on their satellite. But even so, their technological level is uncomfortably high. They may have atomic power. The scientists are still trying to make up their minds about that. What harm can it do if the people do know? Plenty. If the Commodore decides to carry on without making a landing, an attempt at conquest, think of the disappointment. There might be mutiny even. The technique for handling such a situation has to be worked out. I've a good mind, she flared, to go out into the alleyways, the public rooms, and shout what you've told me throughout the ship. As wife of the chronicler, he told her, you've taken the oath of loyalty and secrecy. This is more important than any oath, she snapped. It is not. The lights flickered. What was that? She demanded. Crandall's taking some more readings of the native radio signals, she said. They've had to switch off the meteor screen. Isn't that dangerous? No, the chances of our being struck are infinitesimal. The lights went out. Rogerez realized that he was on the deck with Suzette in his arms. He was deafened by the concussions that had slammed through the huge hull, heard only faintly the thudding shut of airtight doors, the thin, high scream of escaping atmosphere. Somebody was whispering. It was, he realized, the bulkhead speaker. Spacesuits! Put on your spacesuits! The ship is holed! Another voice was heard. There aren't enough, you fool! Attention all! Attention all! This is the chief officer. The captain is dead. I am in command. The ship has been badly damaged. All navigation personnel will report to control. All engineering personnel to the engine room. The rest of you stay in your cabins and dormitories and prepare for landing. Prepare for landing. There will be a brief period of weightlessness when the ship's revolution about her axis is halted. Weight will return with deceleration. Secure everything. Secure yourselves. Rogerez got unsteadily to his feet, pulled Suzette to hers. Together, groping blindly in the darkness, they found the bunk, fell into it, strapped themselves in. They heard the roar as the rockets were fired, felt the dizziness that came when the rotation slowed and halted, when centrifugal force no longer played the part of gravity. Then, after what could have been either centuries or seconds, weight returned as the ship shook to the blasting of the rockets. "Deceleration," said Rogerez. "We are going down," came Kane's voice from the speaker. Again the rockets fired, and again. There was the whine of the gyroscopes as the ship was turned. There was the thin, barely heard keening of the first tenuous wisps of atmosphere along her sides. There was the screaming roar, the ear-piercing whistle, as the air through which they were rushing found the holes punctured in the sleekness by the meteor swarm. The ship was tilting, and Rogerez was afraid until he realized what had been down could no longer be down. That Kane was turning her again so that she was approaching the planetary surface stern first, dropping down and down the long column of fire of her exhausts. Creaking, protesting, the long untried mechanism of the bunk adjusted itself to the change of conditions. Somewhere children were crying and a man was swearing. The roar of the rockets was steady now, drowning all other noises. More frightening than any sound was the shuddering of the ship. She was old, thought Rogerez, and the metal of her parts must, over the centuries, have crystallized. She was old, and the damage caused by the meteor swarm must have weakened her still further. He tried to visualize the scene in control. Kane and his officers intent over their instruments, the body of the captain flung carelessly and unregarded in some corner. Was it in daylight that they were coming down, he wondered, or was it at night? Was it clear air that they were dropping through, or cloud and storm? One of the rockets was faltering, stammering. Susette cried out in fear as the ship tilted again. Rogerez held her tightly to him. He was muttering to himself, "Fire, you bastard! Fire, you bastard!" Another rocket cut out, and the ship righted. "If we could only see what was happening," cried Susette. "We can guess," said Rogerez. "We're coming down on 6 jets instead of 8. Kane had to cut one of the good ones to counterbalance the bad one." Again there was the uneven, terrifying hammering. Again the ship tilted. Again she righted, and the diminution of the rocket's thunder was more frightening than the tilting had been. "Control here," came Kane's voice. "We are coming down too fast for a safe landing. I am trying to bring her down in what appears to be a body of calm water. Be ready to throw off your safety belts the moment we touch. The ship is badly holed and will not stay afloat for long. Get ready to abandon ship as soon as we touch." Rogers remembered how, at every council meeting, there had been those who had maintained that the space occupied by the ship's swimming pool could be put to much better use. He was glad that they had never been able to carry their point. She hit, not too hard, and there was a great hissing and bubbling as her incandescent exhausts boiled the water around her. She went down, and then, swaying gently, floated to the surface. Rogerez unsnapped the buckles of the belt holding Susette and himself to the bunk. He jumped down onto what had been a bulkhead, was now the deck. He managed to open the sliding door. There were dim emergency lights burning in the alleyway outside, and they were shining on the crowds of people making their way to the axial shaft. There was little panic, but there was a determination to get out of the ship as soon as possible. Rogerez knew that should he or Susette fall, they would never be able to get up again. He took her hand and tucked it in the waistband of his trunks. All they could do thereafter was go with the crowd. The alleyway had been crowded, but the axial shaft was almost jammed. Rogerez and Susette were pushed into it by the crush behind them, then went up it almost without touching the ladder rungs. Below them were gurglings and splashings, sounds that told of the encroachment of water into the ship. There was an occasional cry, an occasional curse. Somewhere, with idiot persistence, the speaker was repeating, "Abandon ship! Abandon ship!" Then Rogerez and Susette were at the forward airlock. There was no holding back, no chance of a pause to evaluate, to decide upon a plan of action. They were swept through the little compartment by the press of bodies behind them until in a matter of seconds the deck was gone from beneath their feet and they were falling. The chronicler glimpsed gray sky and tall, incredibly tall trees looming through the mist as he fell, and then all was blotted out by the water. He fought viciously to free himself from the entwining arms and legs of those who had fallen with him, after him. He broke surface at last, coughing and sputtering. He looked around him frantically until he saw Susette's pale hair and paler face. Together they struck out for the dark line of the shore. Kane, aided by Deal and Claver, called the roll. Rogerez, his stylus and notebook were little the worse for their immersion, wrote down the figures after them. We were lucky. 7 men, including the captain, 5 women, and 16 children died in the meteor shower. 3 men, 8 women, and 6 children are missing, presumed drowned, after the landing. Over 1,000 of our ship's company have survived. Lucky? Demanded Deal, who was holding the hand lamp while Rogerez wrote. Lucky, you say? All of our heavy weapons have been lost with the ship. With them, we could have destroyed a city. He turned to Kane. As for you, why couldn't you have landed near one of their cities? Why couldn't you have landed on solid ground? If I had, replied Kane, we'd have been lucky to have had 10 survivors, and the people of the city could have finished us off with ease. I got us here. I did my job. You're in charge now, soldier. Let's see what you can do. All right, snapped D. All non-military officers will get the people formed into a column, at the head of which I shall place my own men. We shall march, he consulted his compass, west. I suppose that this planet has got a magnetic field, Kane. It has. All right, we march west, away from the lake. We must get out of this damn jungle as soon as possible. For all we know, it's teeming with night predators. At sunrise, which shouldn't be far off, we halt to take stock. Why not wait until sunrise before marching? Because I say so, snapped Deal. Get the people organized and we'll make a start. What about a rear guard? Asked Kane. Are you trying to teach me my business? Demanded the soldier. Nevertheless, Roger has noted that he made arrangements for both a rear guard and flanking parties. Whistles sounded, and the long column began its march. The chronicler, with Susette, took his place, with Kane at the head of the civilians. As he walked, he looked around him, trying to make out as much as possible in the dim, misty light. He could see little beyond the tall, straight stems, many times the height of a man, between which they threaded their way. Now and again there were other, thicker trunks, and the tops of the growths supported by them were lost in the mist. Roots, like cables over the ground, made going difficult. Ahead of the column, Deal was blowing his whistle, a series of short, urgent blasts. Kane repeated the signal with his whistle. It was repeated again by the other officers. There were cries of alarm and apprehension as the march halted. There's something there, whispered Kane to Rogerez. Do you hear it? There was something there ahead, something that crashed through the jungle toward them, something big. Rogerez saw it in the glare of the soldiers' hand lamps. It was huge and spiny, and the mouth in that long pointed face was open, showing sharp, yellow teeth. Its black eyes glared at them hungrily. Fire! Shouted Deal. The rattle of the handguns was deafening. Blinded, the beast reared up, its taloned forepaws scrambling at its ruined eyes. Fire! Shouted Deal again. The bullets tore into its soft underbelly. It screamed deafeningly, fell on its side, flattening the tall, spear-like growths. It screamed again and jerked convulsively. It was dead. Walking slowly, Deal came back to confer with Kane. This was supposed to be a civilized world, he said bitterly. How do you account for that? Even on our own planet, replied Kane, There were vast areas of primitive jungle at the time of the invasion. You yourself said that we should be on our guard against night predators." "I didn't expect anything quite so big," said the soldier. "I didn't expect something that it would take all my firepower to dispose of." "You disposed of it," said the chief officer. "Yes, but ammunition isn't unlimited. I hope that anything else we meet will be of a size that we can handle with our machetes." Roger has left them talking, walked with Susette to look at the dead animal. He didn't like what he saw. The spiny body armor suggested that it must have enemies bigger and fiercer than itself. He examined one of the smaller spikes. His hand would just fit comfortably around the base of it. "Deal!" he shouted. "Yes, Rogers? Come here a minute, will you?" "What is it?" asked the soldier. "First of all," said Rogers, "there must be bigger animals than this one around. It's built for defense rather than for attack. We can assume that it feeds on beasts smaller than itself, such as ourselves. It can supply us with weapons against such creatures." "How?" "Don't you ever read military history? Pikes, man, pikes." The sun was up, but the mist persisted, looming gigantic on either side. Towering high above what he had called in his notes the spear trees were other growths, seeming to reach to the very sky itself. Ahead of them was the vague silhouette of what could only be a mountain, but a mountain constructed on improbable geometrical lines, in whose sheer sides gleamed enormous sheets of some highly polished material that reflected the almost level rays of the sun. "Volcanic," grunted Kane, and Rogers agreed, but in his mind he wasn't sure. Then they were out of the jungle and crossing a wide, bare clearing, stumbling and slipping a little on the coarse gravel. Deal ordered a detour. He did not, he said, like the looks of tunnels that run down into the earth at a steep angle. There was something artificial about them, he said. Suddenly, the nearer of the tunnels erupted a swarm of glistening red bodies that deployed rapidly over the plain, that closed in on the advance guard with a pincer movement. Rogers was shocked to see that they were not humanoid, that they ran on all 6 of their jointed legs, that their weapons were their vicious laterally hinged jaws. Calmly, with deliberation, the soldiers were firing, at first. Then, in spite of Deal's shouts, an element of hysteria crept into their fighting. These natives were so hard to kill, pressed on to the attack with their legs missing and half their bodies shot away. Kane took charge of the rest of the column. "Children in the center," he bellowed. "The rest of you, form a tight ring. Use your pikes." The maneuver was accomplished, although not without confusion, not without casualties. Kane was dead, his head ripped from his shoulders. Clever was dead, her body cut in 2. Deal, Rogers noted as he fended off attack with his pike, was down. The air was heavy with the odor of spilled blood and the acrid stench of the ichor flowing from the bodies of the natives. The worst of it was that there were so many of them. In a seemingly inexhaustible stream, they flowed from their tunnels, rushed to the attack over the bodies of their comrades. The soldiers had exhausted their ammunition, were fighting with machetes and spears. The handful of them who survived retreated to the main body. Rogers was bleeding, his shirt ripped from his body by a serrated claw. It seemed that he had been fighting for an eternity, that all he had ever known, ever would know, was the thrusting of the point of his pike into the soft joints of body armor between gaping, clashing mandibles. Beside him, Susette had lost her spear. It had been bitten clean in 2 and was wielding a machete taken from a dead soldier. Rogers realized dimly that it had been all of 5 minutes since he had used his spear. He looked around him. The tunnel mouths gaped black and empty. On the blood-stained gravel were the bodies of men and women, the bodies of the enemy. The human corpses were still. Those of the natives were not. Clawed legs twitched jerkily, sharp mandibles still opened and shut viciously. "Rogerez," somebody was saying, "what do we do now?" "Ask Deal," he said. "Ask Kane." But Deal was dead, and with him his junior officers and his sergeants. Kane was dead, and the purser was dead, and the engineers had died during the landing. As chronicler, Rogerez ranked as an officer. In the past he had enjoyed the privileges of rank. He had never thought that he would have to accept the responsibilities. He said, "Find all the handlights that are still working. Collect all the machetes and the shorter spears. We are going down into the city." "But the natives?" "We'll never be safe until we have a fortified place of our own. The natives must have sent all their soldiers out against us. Killing the rest should be easy." It wasn't easy, but it was not as hard as Rogerez had anticipated. There was fighting in the tunnels and passages, and there were more casualties, but they were not heavy ones. It was in the very heart of the city that the stiffest resistance was encountered, and there, in a huge chamber, 20 guards put up a desperate and stubborn defense. They went down at last, hacked to pieces by the machete-men. Rogerez looked at the bulk of the being whom they had defended so grimly. He looked at the great flaccid body, at the faceted eyes that glinted in the light of the hand lamps that glared into his. "Kill it," he ordered. The pikes drove home. "What now?" asked Suzette. "This will be our headquarters," said Rogerez. To his men he said, "Drag that thing out of here into that side tunnel. Pass word that I want all the natives' bodies dragged out and buried, and the bodies of our own people brought inside before some vile scavenger finds them. We'll make a grave of one of the tunnels. Then I want parties to go through the city to dispose of any survivors, and to report to me on the discovery of any records or artifacts or stores or foodstuffs. We've seen no artifacts. There's no artificial lighting even. What about the city lights we saw from our orbit? Civilization and savagery can exist together on the same planet," said Rogerez. "We landed among savages." He sat on the ground, his back against the wall of the chamber. He was tired, and his wounds were painful. He was thankful for the pain. It kept him awake. He was able to acknowledge the reports of various parties as they told him of the discovery of gardens of fungi, of the finding of a chamber in which, in silken bags, were loathsome beings that seemed to be the young of the natives. He nibbled a piece of the fungus brought to him by one of the foraging parties, pronounced it edible. It was not unlike the yeast from the ship's vats. At last, with affairs organized to his satisfaction, he felt justified in ordering a general stand-down. Sentries had been posted, and arrangements made to pass messages by word of mouth through the tunnels and passages. Nothing further could be attempted, he knew, until all hands had been refreshed by sleep. Thankfully, he himself sank into unconsciousness with Suzette by his side. He was awakened just before the end by a confused bawling. As in a dream, he heard the words screamed rather than shouted. "Like mountains! Like mountains walking!" There was a dreadful thudding overhead that threatened to crush the underground city. And then the scalding water sweeping through tunnels and chambers, seeping into every last crevice, finished conclusively what had begun by shipwreck and battle. The man cursed as the spines of the dead hedgehog pricked his ankle. He stooped to examine the little body. "Hello," he said. "I wonder what did this." "Never mind the hedgehog," said his wife. "It's those dreadful ants that I'm after." She stood with the empty kettle in her hand, looking down with satisfaction at the steaming earth around the nest. "There'll be more of them," said her husband pessimistically.
Recording by Sophie Owen. A Little Journey by Ray Bradbury. There were two important things. One, that she was very old. Two, that Mr. Thirkell was taking her to God. For hadn't he patted her hand and said, "Mrs. Bellows, we'll take off into space in my rocket and go to find him together." And that was how it was going to be. Oh, this wasn't like any other group Mrs. Bellows had ever joined. In her fervour to light a path for her delicate, tottering feet, she had struck matches down dark alleys and found her way to Hindu mystics who floated their flickering, starry eyelashes over crystal balls. She had walked on the meadow paths with ascetic Indian philosophers imported by daughters in spirit of Madame Blavatsky. She had made pilgrimages to California's stucco jungles to hunt the astrological seer in his natural habitat. She had even consented to signing away the rights to one of her homes in order to be taken into the shouting order of a temple of amazing evangelists who had promised her golden smoke, crystal fire, and the great soft hand of God coming to bear her home. None of these people had ever shaken Mrs. Bellows' faith, even when she saw them sirened away in a black wagon in the night, or discovered their pictures bleak and unromantic in the morning tabloids. The world had roughed them up and locked them away because they knew too much, that was all. And then, 2 weeks ago, she had seen Mr. Thirkell's advertisement in New York City. "Come to Mars. Stay at the Thirkell Restorium for 1 week, and then on into space on the greatest adventure life can offer. Send for free pamphlet, Nearer My God to Thee. Excursion rates, round trip slightly lower." Round trip, Mrs. Bellows had thought. But who would come back after seeing him? And so she had bought a ticket and flown off to Mars, and spent several mild days at Mr. Thirkell's Restorium, the building with the sign on it which flashed, "Thirkell's Rocket to Heaven." She had spent the week bathing in limpid waters and erasing the care from her tiny bones, and now she was fidgeting, ready to be loaded into Mr. Thirkell's own special private rocket, like a bullet, to be fired on out into space beyond Jupiter and Saturn and Pluto. And thus, who could deny it? You would be getting nearer and nearer to the Lord. How wonderful! Couldn't you just feel him drawing near? Couldn't you just sense his breath, his scrutiny, his presence? "Here I am," said Mrs. Bellows, "an ancient rickety elevator, ready to go up the shaft. God need only press the button." Now, on the 7th day, as she minced up the steps of the Restorium, a number of small doubts assailed her. "For one thing," she said aloud to no one, "it isn't quite the land of milk and honey here on Mars that they said it would be. My room is like a cell, the swimming pool is really quite inadequate, and besides, how many widows who look like mushrooms or skeletons want to swim? And finally, the whole Restorium smells of boiled cabbage and tennis shoes." She had opened the front door and let it slam somewhat irritably. She was amazed at the other women in the auditorium. It was like wandering in a carnival mirror maze, coming again and again upon yourself. The same flowery face, the same chicken hands and jingling bracelets. One after another of the images of herself floated before her. She put out her hand, but it wasn't a mirror. It was another lady shaking her fingers and saying, "We're waiting for Mr. Thirkell. Shh." "Ah," whispered everyone. The velvet curtains parted. Mr. Thirkell appeared, fantastically serene, his Egyptian eyes upon everyone. But there was something, nevertheless, in his appearance which made one expect him to call "Hi!" while fuzzy dogs jumped over his legs, through his hooped arms and over his back. Then, dogs and all, he should dance with a dazzling piano-keyboard smile off into the wings. Mrs. Bellows, with a secret part of her mind, which she constantly had to grip tightly, expected to hear a cheap Chinese gong sound when Mr. Thirkell entered. His large, liquid, dark eyes were so improbable that one of the old ladies had facetiously claimed she saw a mosquito cloud hovering over them, as they did around summer rain barrels. And Mrs. Bellows sometimes caught the scent of the theatrical mothball and the smell of calliope steam on his sharply pressed suit. But with the same savage rationalisation that had greeted all other disappointments in her rickety life, she bit at the suspicion and whispered, "This time it's real. This time it'll work. Haven't we got a rocket?" Mr. Thirkell bowed. He smiled a sudden comedy mask smile. The old ladies looked in at his epiglottis and sensed chaos there. Before he even began to speak, Mrs. Bellows saw him picking up each of his words, oiling it, making sure it ran smooth on its rails. Her heart squeezed in like a tiny fist, and she gritted her porcelain teeth. "Friends," said Mr. Thirkell, and he could hear the frost snap in the hearts of the entire assemblage. "No," said Mrs. Bellows ahead of time. She could hear the bad news rushing at her, and herself tied to the track while the immense black wheels threatened and the whistles screamed, helpless. "There will be a slight delay," said Mr. Thirkell. In the next instant, Mr. Thirkell might have cried, or been tempted to cry, "Ladies, be seated," in minstrel fashion, for the ladies had come up at him from their chairs, protesting and trembling. "Not a very long delay." Mr. Thirkell put up his hands to pat the air. "How long?" "Only a week." "A week?" "Yes. You can stay here at the Restore Room for 7 more days, can't you? A little delay won't matter, will it, in the end? You've waited a lifetime. Only a few more days." "At $20 a day," thought Mrs. Bellows coldly. "What's the trouble?" a woman cried. "A legal difficulty," said Mr. Thirkell. "We've a rocket, haven't we?" "Well, yes, but I've been here a whole month waiting," said one old lady. "Delays, delays." "That's right," said everyone. "Ladies, ladies," murmured Mr. Thirkell, smiling serenely. "We want to see the rocket." It was Mrs. Bellows forging ahead alone, brandishing her fist like a toy hammer. Mr. Thirkell looked into the old lady's eyes, a missionary among albino cannibals. "Well, now," he said. "Yes, now!" cried Mrs. Bellows. "I'm afraid," he began. "So am I," she said. "That's why we want to see the ship." "No, now, Mrs." He snapped his fingers for her name. "Bellows!" she cried. She was a small container, but now all the seething pressures that had been built up over long years came steaming through the delicate vents of her body. Her cheeks became incandescent. With a wail that was like a melancholy factory whistle, Mrs. Bellows ran forward and hung to him, almost by her teeth, like a summer-maddened Spitz. She would not, and never could let go until he died, and the other women followed, jumping and yapping like a pound let loose on its trainer, the same one who had petted them and to whom they had squirmed and whined joyfully an hour before, now milling about him, creasing his sleeves and frightening the Egyptian serenity from his gaze. "This way!" cried Mrs. Bellows, feeling like Madame Lafarge. "Through the back! We've waited long enough to see the ship. Every day he's put us off. Every day we've waited. Now let's see." No, ladies!" cried Mr. Thirkell, leaping about. They burst through the back of the stage and out a door like a flood, bearing the poor man with them into a shed, and then out, quite suddenly, into an abandoned gymnasium. "There it is," said someone. "The rocket." And then a silence fell that was terrible to entertain. There was the rocket. Mrs. Bellows looked at it, and her hand sagged away from Mr. Thirkell's collar. The rocket was something like a battered copper pot. There were 1,000 bulges and rents and rusty pipes and dirty vents on and in it. The ports were clouded over with dust, resembling the eyes of a blind hog. Everyone wailed a little sighing wail. "Is that the rocket ship, glory be to the highest?" cried Mrs. Bellows, appalled. Mr. Thirkell nodded and looked at his feet. "For which we paid out our $1,000 apiece and came all the way to Mars to get on board with you and go off to find him?" asked Mrs. Bellows. "Why, that isn't worth a sack of dried peas," said Mrs. Bellows. "It's nothing but junk." "Junk," whispered everyone, getting hysterical. "Don't let him get away!" Mr. Thirkell tried to break and run, but 1,000 possum traps closed on him from every side. He withered. Everybody walked around in circles like blind mice. There was a confusion and a weeping that lasted for 5 minutes as they went over and touched the rocket, the dented kettle, the rusty container for God's children. "Well," said Mrs. Bellows. She stepped up into the askew doorway of the rocket and faced everyone. "It looks as if a terrible thing has been done to us," she said. "I haven't any money to go back home to Earth, and I've too much pride to go to the government and tell them a common man like this has fooled us out of our life savings. I don't know how you feel about it, all of you, but the reason all of us came is because I'm 85, and you're 89, and you're 78, and all of us are nudging on towards 100, and there's nothing on Earth for us, and it doesn't appear there's anything on Mars either. We all expected not to breathe much more air or crochet many more doilies, or we'd never have come here. So what I have to propose is a simple thing. To take a chance." She reached out and touched the rusted hulk of the rocket. "This is our rocket. We paid for our trip, and we're going to take our trip." Everyone rustled and stood on tiptoes and opened an astonished mouth. Mr. Thirkell began to cry. He did it quite easily and very effectively. "We're going to get in this ship," said Mrs. Bellows, ignoring him, "and we're going to take off to where we were going." Mr. Thirkell stopped crying long enough to say, "But it was all a fake. I don't know anything about space. He's not out there anyway, I lied. I don't know where he is, and I couldn't find him if I wanted to. And you were fools to ever take my word on it." "Yes," said Mrs. Bellows. "We were fools. I'll go along on that. But you can't blame us, for we are old. And it was a lovely, good, and fine idea. One of the loveliest ideas in the world. Oh, we didn't really fool ourselves that we could get nearer to him physically. It was a gentle, mad dream of old people, the kind of thing you hold on to for a few minutes a day, even though you know it's not true. So all of you who want to go, you'll follow me in the ship." "But you can't go," said Mr. Thirkell. "You haven't got a navigator, and that ship's a ruin." "You," said Mrs. Bellows, "will be the navigator." She stepped into the ship, and after a moment the other old ladies pressed forward. Mr. Thirkell, windmilling his arms frantically, was nevertheless pressed through the port, and in a minute the door slammed shut. Mr. Thirkell was strapped into the navigator's seat, with everyone talking at once and holding him down. The special helmets were issued to be fitted over every grey or white head to supply extra oxygen in case of a leakage in the ship's hull. And at long last the hour had come, and Mrs. Bellows stood behind Mr. Thirkell and said, "We're ready, sir." He said nothing. He pleaded with them silently, using his great dark wet eyes, but Mrs. Bellows shook her head and pointed to the control. "Take off," agreed Mr. Thirkell morosely, and pulled a switch. Everybody fell. The rocket went up from the planet Mars in a great fiery glide, with the noise of an entire kitchen thrown down an elevator shaft, with a sound of pots and pans and kettles and fires boiling and stews bubbling, with a smell of burned incense and rubber and sulphur, with a colour of yellow fire and a ribbon of red stretching below them, and all the old women singing and holding to each other, and Mrs. Bellows crawling upright in the sighing, straining, trembling ship. "Head for space, Mr. Thirkell." "It can't last," said Mr. Thirkell sadly. "This ship can't last. It will. It did. The rocket exploded." Mrs. Bellows felt herself lifted and thrown about dizzily like a doll. She heard the great screamings and saw the flashes of bodies sailing by her in fragments of metal and powdery light. "Help! Help!" cried Mr. Thirkell, far away on a small radio beam. The ship disintegrated into 1,000,000 parts, and the old ladies, all 100 of them, were flung straight on ahead with the same velocity as the ship. As for Mr. Thirkell, for some reason of trajectory, perhaps, he had been blown out of the other side of the ship. Mrs. Bellows saw him falling separate and away from them, screaming, screaming. "There goes Mr. Thirkell," thought Mrs. Bellows. And she knew where he was going. He was going to be burned and roasted and broiled good, but very good. Mr. Thirkell was falling down into the sun. "And here we are," thought Mrs. Bellows. "Here we are, going on out, and out, and out." There was hardly a sense of motion at all, but she knew that she was travelling at 50,000 miles an hour, and would continue to travel at that speed for an eternity, until... She saw the other women swinging all about her in their own trajectories, a few minutes of oxygen left to each of them in their helmets, and each was looking up to where they were going. Of course, thought Mrs. Bellows. Out into space. Out, and the darkness like a great church, and the stars like candles, and in spite of everything, Mr. Thirkell, the rocket, and the dishonesty, we are going toward the Lord. And there, yes, there, as she fell on and on, coming toward her, she could almost discern the outline now. Coming toward her was his mighty golden hand, reaching down to hold her and comfort her like a frightened sparrow. "I'm Mrs. Amelia Bellows," she said quietly in her best company voice. "I'm from the planet Earth."
The Mathematicians by Arthur Feldman. They were in the garden. "Now, Zoe," said Xenia Hawkins to her 9-year-old daughter,
Quit fluttering around and Papa will tell you a story. Zoe settled down in the hammock. A true story, Papa?
It all happened exactly like I'm going to tell you, said Drake Hawkins, pinching Zoe's rosy cheek. Now, 2011 years ago in 1985, figuring by the earthly calendar of that time, a tribe of beings from the dog star Sirius invaded the Earth.
And what did these things look like, Father?
Like humans in many, many respects. They each had 2 arms, 2 legs, and all the other organs that humans are endowed with.
Wasn't there any difference at all between the star beings and the humans, Papa?
There was. The newcomers, each and all, had a pair of wings covered with green feathers growing from their shoulders and long purple tails.
How many of these beings were there, Father?
Exactly 3,041,000 male adults and 3 female adults. These creatures first appeared on Earth on the island of Sardinia. In 5 weeks' time, they were the masters of the entire globe.
Didn't the Earthlings fight back, Papa?
The humans warred against the invaders, using bullets, ordinary bombs, superatom bombs and gases.
What were those things like, Father?
Oh, they've passed out of existence long ago. Ammunition, they were called. The humans fought each other with such things.
And not with ideas like we do now, Father?
No, with guns, just like I told you, but the invaders were immune to the ammunition.
What does immune mean?
Proof against harm. Then the humans tried germs and bacteria against the star beings.
What were those things?
Tiny, tiny bugs that the humans tried to inject into the bodies of the invaders to make them sicken and die. But the bugs had no effect at all on the star beings.
Go on, Papa. These beings overran all Earth. Go on from there.
You must know, these newcomers were vastly more intelligent than the Earthlings. In fact, the invaders were the greatest mathematicians in the system.
What's the system? And what does mathematician mean?
The Milky Way. A mathematician is one who is good at figuring, weighing, measuring, clever with numbers.
Then, Father, the invaders killed off all the Earthlings?
Not at all. They killed many, but many others were enslaved. Just as the humans had used horses and cattle, the newcomers so used the humans. They made workers out of some, others they slaughtered for food.
Papa, what sort of language did the star beings talk?
Oh, very simple language. But the humans were never able to master it, so the invaders, being so much smarter, mastered all the languages of the globe.
What did the Earthlings call the invaders, Father?
Anvils. Half angels, half devils.
Then, Papa, everything was peaceful on Earth after the Anvils enslaved the humans?
For a little while. Then some of the most daring of the humans, led by a man named Noel, escaped into the interior of Greenland. This Noel was a psychiatrist, the foremost on Earth.
What's a psychiatrist?
A dealer in ideas.
Then he was very rich.
He'd been the richest human on Earth. After some profound thought, Noel figured a way to rid the Earth of the Anvils.
How, Papa?
He perfected a method called the Noel-Hughes Helsinki technique of imbuing the Anvils with human emotions.
What does imbuing mean?
He filled them full of and made them aware of. Xenia interrupted.
Are you talking a bit above the child's understanding, Drake? No, Mamma, said Zoe. I understand what Papa explained. Now don't interrupt.
So Noel, continued Drake, filled the Anvils with human feelings such as love, hate, ambition, jealousy, malice, envy, despair, hope, fear, shame, and so on. Very soon the Anvils were acting like humans, and in 10 days terrible civil wars wiped out the Anvil population by 2/3.
Then, Papa, the Anvils finally killed off each other?
Almost. Until among them a being named Zalibar, full of saintliness and persuasion, preached the brotherhood of all Anvils. The invaders, quickly converted, quit the quarrels, and the Earthlings were even more enslaved.
Oh, Papa, weren't Noel and his followers in Greenland awfully sad the way things turned out?
For a while. Then Noel came up with a final payoff.
Is that slang, Papa? Payoff?
Yes, the coup de grace, the ace in the hole that he saved if all else failed.
I understand, Papa. The idea that would out-trump anything the other side had to offer. What was it, Father? What did they have?
Noel imbued the Anvils with nostalgia.
What is nostalgia?
Homesickness.
Oh, Papa, wasn't Noel smart? That meant the Anvils were all filled with the desire to fly back to the star from where they had started?
Exactly. So one day all the Anvils, an immense army, flapped their great green wings, assembled in the Black Hills of North America, and at a given signal they all rose up from earth, and all the humans chanted, "Glory, glory, the day of our deliverance."
So then, Father, all the Anvils flew away from earth?
Not all. There were 2 child Anvils, one male and one female, aged 2 years, who had been born on earth, and they started off with all the others and flew up into the sky. But when they reached the upper limits of the stratosphere, they hesitated, turned tail, and fluttered back to earth where they had been born. Their names were Zizo and Ziza.
And what happened to Zizo and Ziza, Papa?
Well, like all the Anvils, they were great mathematicians, so they multiplied.
Oh, Papa,
laughed Zoe, flapping her wings excitedly.
That was a very nice story.
Shipwreck in the Sky by Iando Binder. Recording by Robert Schwartz. The flight into space that made pilot Captain Dan Barstow famous. The flight was listed at GHQ as Project Songbird. It was sponsored by the Space Medicine Labs of the U.S. Air Force, and its pilot was Captain Dan Barstow. A hand-picked man, Dan Barstow, chosen for the Air Force's most important project of the year because he and his VX-3 had already broken all previous records set by hordes of V-2s, Navy Aerobees, and anything else that flew the skyways. Dan Barstow, first man to cross the sea of air and sight open unlimited space. Pioneer flight to infinity. He grinned and hummed to himself as he settled down for the long jaunt. Too busy to be either thrilled or scared, he considered the 37 instruments he'd have to read, the twice that many records to keep, and the miles of camera film to run. He had been hand-picked and thoroughly conditioned to take it all without more than 10% increases in his pulse rate. So he worked as matter-of-factly as if he were down in the G's centrifuge of the Space Medicine Labs, where he had been schooled for this trip for months. He kept up a running fire of oral reports through his helmet radio, down to Rough Rock and his CO. "All roger, sir. Temperature falling fast, but this rubberoid spacesuit keeps me cozy. No chills. Doc Blaine will be happy to hear that. Weightless sensations pretty queer, and I feel upside down as much as right side up, but no bad effects. Taking shots of the sun's corona now with color film." "Huh? Oh, yes, sir. It's beautiful, all right, now that you mentioned it. But hell, sir, who's got the time for aesthetics now? Oops, that was a close one. 10th meteor whizzing past. Makes me think of flak back on those Berlin bombing runs." Dan couldn't help wincing when the meteors peppered down past. The flak of space. Below, he could see the meteors flare up brightly as they hit the atmosphere. Most of those near his position were small, none bigger than a baseball, and Dan took comfort in the fact that his rocket was small too in the immensity around him. A direct hit would be sheer bad luck. But the good old law of averages were on his side. "Yes, Colonel, this tin can I'm riding is holding together okay," Dan continued to Rough Rock. If he paused even a second in his reports, a top sergeant's yell from the colonel's throat came back for him to keep talking. Every bit of information he could transmit to them was a vital revelation in this U.S. Air Force Alpha exploration of open space beyond Earth's air cushion, with ceiling unlimited to infinity. "Cosmic rays, sir? Sure, the reading shot up double on the Geiger." "Huh? Nah, I don't feel a thing. Like Doc Baird suspected, we invented a lot of old wives' tales in advance, before going into space. I feel fine, so you can put down cosmic ray intensity as a boogeyman." "What's that?" Yeah, sir. The stars shine without winking up here." "What else?" "Space is icky black. No deep purples or queer. More than blacks like some jetted up writers dreamed up. Just plain old ordinary dead black. Earth, sir? Well, it does look dish-shaped from up here. Concave. Sure, I can see all the way to Europe, and say, here's something unexpected. I can see that hurricane off the coast of Florida. You said it, sir. Once we install permanent space stations up here, it will be easy to spot typhoons, volcano eruptions, tidal waves, earthquakes, what have you, the moment they start up. If you ask me, with a good telescope, you could even spot forest fires the minute they broke out, not to mention a sneak bombing on a target city. Huh? Sorry, sir, I forgot. Dan broke off and almost retched as his stomach turned a flip-flop to end all flip-flops. The VX-3 had reached the peak of its trajectory at over 1,000 miles altitude and now turned down, lazily at first. He gulped oxygen from the emergency tube at his lips and felt better. Turning back on schedule, Rough Rock. Peak altitude 1,037 miles. Everything's fine, no danger. This was all a cinch. Hey, wait, something not in the books has popped up. Stand by. Dan had felt the rocket swing a bit, strangely, as if gripped by a strong force. Instead of falling directly down towards Earth with a slight pitch, it slanted sideways and spun on its long axis. And then Dan saw what it was. Beneath, intercepting his trajectory, coming around fast over the curvature of the Earth, was a tiny black worldlet, 998 miles above Earth. It might be an enormous meteor, but Dan felt he was right the first time, for it wasn't falling like a meteor, but swinging parallel to Earth's surface on an even keel. He stared at the unexpected discovery, as amazed as if it were a fire-breathing dragon out of a legend. For it was, actually, he realized in a swift, stunned comprehension, more amazing than any legend. Dan kept his voice calm. Hello, Rough Rock? Listen, nobody expected this. Hold your hat, sir, and sit down. I've discovered a second moon of Earth. Huh? You heard me right. A second moon. Tie that, will you? Sure, it's tiny. Less than a mile in diameter, I'd say. Dead black in color. Guess that's why telescopes never spotted it. Tiny and black, blends into the black backdrop of space. It has terrific speed, and that little Maverick's gravitational field caught my rocket. Of course, it can't yank me away from Earth's gravity, but the trouble is, yipe, my rocket and that moonlet may be in for a mutual collision course. Dan's trained eyes suddenly saw that grim possibility. Barreling around Earth in a narrow orbit with a speed of something near over 12,000 miles an hour, the tiny new moon had, since his ascent, charged directly into his downward free fall. It was a chance in 1,000 for a direct hit, except for one added factor. The moonlet exerted enough gravity pull out of its many million-ton bulk to warp the rocket into its path, and 1,000-to-1 odds were thus wiped out, becoming even money. Nip and tuck, reported Dan, answering the excited pleadings and questions from Rough Rock. It won't be a head-on crash. I may even miss entirely. Oh, Lord, not with that spire of rock sticking up from it. I'm going to hit that. Dan had heard an atomic bomb blast once, and it sounded like a string of them set off at once as the rocket smashed into the rocky prominence. The rock splintered. The rocket splintered. But Dan was not there to be splintered likewise. He had jammed down a button at the critical moment, and the rocket's emergency escape hatch had ejected him a split second before the violent impact. But Dan blacked out, receiving some of the concussion of the exploding rocket. When his eyes snapped open, he was floating like a feather in open, airless space. His rubberoid spacesuit, living up to its rigid tests, have inflated to its elastic limit. But it held, and within, its automatic units began feeding him oxygen, heat, and radio power. He had a chance now, because he had been ejected cleanly from the rocket without damage to the protective suit. The stars wheeled dizzily around him. Dan finally saw the reason why. He was not just floating as a free agent in space. He was circling the black moonlet at perhaps 1,000 yards from its pitted surface. Hello, Rough Rock, he called. Still alive and kicking, sir. Only now, of all crazy mad things, I'm a moon of this moon. The collision must have knocked me clear out of my down-to-earth orbit. I must have been ejected in the same direction as the moonlet's course. In its gravity field, I don't know. Let an electric brain figure it out sometime. Anyway, now I'm being dragged along in the orbit of the moonlet. How about that? Yes, sir, I'm circling down closer and closer to the moonlet. No, don't worry, sir. It was a weak gravity pull, only a fraction of an Earth G. So I'm drifting down, gently as a cloud. Stand by for my landing on Earth's second moon. The bloated figure in the bulging spacesuit circled the black stony surface several more times, in a narrowing spiral, and finally landed with a soft skidding bump that didn't even jar Dan's teeth. He bounced several more times from a diminishing height of 50-odd feet in grotesque slow motion before he finally came to a stop. He sat still for a moment, adjusting to the fantastic fact of being shipwrecked on an uncharted moonlet, crowding down his pulse rate, which might be over 10% normal now. Okay, Rough Rock, I hear you. You're telling me, sir. Obviously, I'm marooned here. No rocket to leave with. No way to get back to the terra firma. What? If you'll pardon my saying so, sir, that's a silly question. Of course I'm scared. Scared green. Sorry about the rocket, sir. Losing it for you. Me, sir? Thank you, sir. But stop apologizing, will you? I know you haven't got any duplicates of the VX-3 ready. No rescue rocket. Dan listened for a moment longer, then broke in roughly. Oh, for Pete's sake, will you stop crying over me, sir? So I get mine here. I might have gotten it over Berlin, too. Forget it, sir. Dan grinned suddenly. Look, what have I got to kick about? I'll go out in a flash of glory, at least one headline will put it that way, and I'll get credit in the history books as the man who discovered that Earth has 2 moons. What more could I ask, really? Dan blushed at the reply from Rough Rock. Will you lay off, please, Colonel? How else should a man take it? I'm still scared silly inside. But look, I've really got something to report now. This little runt moon makes tracks around Earth in probably 2 hours minus. If I remember my space nautics right, I'm already looking down over the Grand Canyon, heading west. I'm going to get a pretty terrific bird's eye view of the whole world in 2 more hours, which is just about how much oxygen I've got left. Lucky, eh? Dan looked down, watching in fascination the majestic wheeling of the Earth below him. His little moonlet did not rotate, or rather, it rotated once for every revolution around the Earth, as the moon did, keeping one face earthward, giving him an uninterrupted view. The Sierras on Earth hove into clear view, and the broad Pacific. There would follow Hawaii, then Japan, Asia, Europe. No, he saw he was slanting southwest. It would be across the equator, past Australia, perhaps near the South Pole, then up and around over the top of the world, past Greenland, following that great circle around the globe. In any case, his was the speediest trip around the world ever made by man. Before we're out of mutual range, Rough Rock, I'm going to explore this new moon. Me and Columbus. Stand by for reports. Dan did his walking in huge leaps that propelled him 50 feet at a step with slight effort due to the extremely feeble gravity of the tiny body. What did he weigh here? Probably no more than an ounce or 2. Nothing much to report, Colonel. It's a dead, airless, pipsqueak planetoid. Just a big mile-thick rock, probably. No life, no vegetation, no people, no nothing. Guess you might call me the man in the second moon. And the joke's on me. Well, 1 3/4 hours of oxygen left by the gauge, or 105 minutes. Sounds like more that way. What's that, sir? Your voice is getting faint. Any last requests from me? Well, one favor maybe. Pick up my body someday with another rocket. Yeah, it'll stay preserved up here in this deep freeze of space. That's... Sir? Can't hear you much now. Going out of range. Give Betty my fondest. You know the blonde. Well, sir, goodbye now. Dan was glad that Rough Rock's radio voice faded to a whispery nothingness. It wasn't easy to stay casual now. There was nothing more to say, really, and he didn't want to hear any more crying from the CO. The old man had sounded almost hysterical. He wanted just to be alone with his thoughts now, making his final peace with the universe. He checked the gauge with his watch, 90 minutes of oxygen to 0, or, he thought with a grin, eternity minus 90 minutes. He was beginning to have trouble breathing, but it was awesomely grand watching the sweep of Earth beneath him, the procession of dots that were islands strung across the Pacific South Seas like a necklace of green beads. He was still within radio range of ships below at sea, yet he didn't contact them. He had nothing to say, like a ghost in the sky. Idly, he kept pitching loose stones, watching their rifle-like speed away from him. Again, a phenomenon of the weak gravity of the moonlet. Actually, he was able to pick up a boulder 10 feet across and heave it away with ease. We who are about to die amuse ourselves, he thought. Then, because a thread of stubborn hope still clung in a corner of his mind, he got an idea. It had lurked just beyond his mental grasp for some time now. Something significant. Abruptly, facing a light, Dan switched on his radio and contacted a ship below, asking them to relay him to Rough Rock with their more powerful transmitter. "Ahoy, Rough Rock! Stop adding up my insurance, Colonel. I'm coming back." "No, sir. I haven't gone out of my head, sir. It's so simple it's a laugh, sir. See you in a few hours, sir." And he did. Dan grinned when they hauled his dripping form from the sea. Aboard the search plane, they cut him out of the spacesuit to which was still attached his emergency twin parachute. But his helmet was gone, ripped loose, for Dan had been breathing fresh earth air during the long parachute descent. They stared at him, as at a dead man come alive. "Impossible to escape?" he chuckled, repeating their babble. "That's what I thought too, until I remembered those data tables on gravity and escape velocity and such. How on the moon the escape velocity is much less than on Earth. And on that tiny second moon, well, my clue was when I threw a stone into the air and it never came back." Dan gulped hot coffee. "I got off the moonlet myself, then. Got up to more than a mile above it, where I was free of its feeble gravity. But I was still in the same orbit circling Earth. I'd have continued revolving as a human satellite forever, of course, but for this emergency gadget hooked to my belt." Dan held up a metal gun with its empty tank and needle nose half burned away. "Reaction pistol. Fires hydrazine and oxidizer. Ordinary jet rocket principle. Aiming it towards the stars opposite Earth. Its reactive blast shoved me earthward, thanks to Newton. I needed a speed of about 1/2 mile a second. The powerful little jet gun had only my small mass to shove in free space without gravity or friction. That broke me from free fall, around Earth, to gravity fall toward Earth. Then I spiraled down under gravity pull. I reached lung-filling air density just in time, before my oxygen gave out. One more danger was that I began heating up like a meteor due to air friction. I flung out a prayer first, followed by my twin parachutes, designed for extreme initial shock. They held, slowed me to a paratrooper's drift the rest of the way down." "Wait," a puzzled pilot objected. "Your story doesn't hang together. How did you get off that moonlet? How did you get up there, a mile above it, away from its gravity? There was nobody to throw you like a stone." "I threw myself," said Dan. "First, I ran as fast as I could, maybe halfway around that moonlet to get a good running start. And then," Dan Barstow's grin then was undoubtedly the biggest grin in history. "Well, then, since the feeble gravity couldn't pull me back again, what I really did was to jump clear off that moon."
Recording by Winston Tharp. The Spy and the Elevator by Donald E. Westlake. When the elevator didn't come, that just made the day perfect. A broken egg yolk, a stuck zipper, a feedback in the aircon exhaust, the window sticking at full transparency. Well, I won't go through the whole sorry list. Suffice it to say that when the elevator didn't come, that put the roof on the city, as they say. It was just one of those days. Everybody gets them. Days when you're lucky if you make it to nightfall with no bones broken. But of all times for it to happen. For literally months I'd been building my courage up. And finally, just today, I had made my mind up to do it, to propose to Linda. I'd called her second thing this morning, right after the egg yolk, and invited myself down to her place. 10 o'clock, she'd said, smiling sweetly at me out of the phone. She knew why I wanted to talk to her, and when Linda said 10 o'clock, she meant 10 o'clock. Don't get me wrong. I don't mean that Linda's a perfectionist or a harridan or anything like that. Far from it. But she does have a fixation on that one subject of punctuality. The result of her job, of course. She was an ore sled dispatcher. Ore sleds, being robots, were invariably punctual. If an ore sled didn't return on time, no one waited for it. They simply knew that it had been captured by some other project and had blown itself up. Well, of course, after working as an ore sled dispatcher for 3 years, Linda quite naturally was a bit obsessed. I remember one time, shortly after we started dating, when I arrived at her place 5 minutes late and found her having hysterics. She thought I'd been killed. She couldn't visualize anything less than that keeping me from arriving at the designated moment. When I told her what actually had happened, I'd broken a shoelace, she refused to speak to me for 4 days. And then the elevator didn't come. Until then, I'd managed somehow to keep the day's minor disasters from ruining my mood, even while eating that horrible egg. I couldn't very well throw it away, broken yolk or no. It was my breakfast allotment, and I was hungry. And while hurriedly jury-rigging drapery across that gaspingly transparent window, 153 stories straight down to slag, I kept going over and over my prepared proposal speeches, trying to select the most effective one. I had a whimsical approach. "Honey, I see there's a nice little non-P apartment available up on 173. And I had a romantic approach. "Darling, I can't live without you at the moment. Temporarily, I'm madly in love with you. I want to share my life with you for a while. Would you be provisionally mine?" I even had a straightforward approach. "Linda, I'm going to be needing a wife for at least a year or two, and I can't think of anyone I would rather spend that time with than you." Actually, though I couldn't have admitted this to Linda, much less to anyone else, I loved her in more than a non-P way. But even if we had both been genetically desirable, neither of us were, I knew that Linda relished her freedom and independence too much to ever contract for any kind of marriage other than non-P, non-permanent, no progeny. So I rehearsed my various approaches, realizing that when the time came I would probably be so tongue-tied I'd be capable of no more than a blurted, "Will you marry me?" And I struggled with zippers and malfunctioning air cons, and I managed somehow to leave the apartment at 5 minutes to 10. Linda lived down on the 140th floor, 13 floors away. It never took more than 2 or 3 minutes to get to her place, so I was giving myself plenty of time. But then the elevator didn't come. I pushed the button, waited. Nothing happened. I couldn't understand it. The elevator had always arrived before, within 30 seconds of the button being pushed. This was a local stop, with an elevator that traveled between the 133rd floor and the 167th floor, where it was possible to make connections for either the next local or for the express. So it couldn't be more than 20 stories away, and this was a non-rush hour. I pushed the button again, and then I waited some more. I looked at my watch, and it was 3 minutes to 10. 2 minutes, and no elevator. If it didn't arrive this instant, this second, I would be late. It didn't arrive. I vacillated, not knowing what to do next. Stay, hoping the elevator would come after all, or hurry back to the apartment and call Linda to give her advance warning that I would be late. 10 more seconds and still no elevator. I chose the second alternative, raced back down the hall, and thumbed my way into my apartment. I dialed Linda's number, and the screen lit up with white letters on black, "Privacy Disconnection." Of course, Linda expected me at any moment, and she knew what I wanted to say to her, so quite naturally she had disconnected the phone to keep us from being interrupted. Frantic, I dashed from the apartment again, back down the hall to the elevator, and leaned on that blasted button with all my weight. Even if the elevator should arrive now, I would still be almost a minute late. No matter, it didn't arrive. I would have been in a howling rage anyway, but this impossibly piled on top of all the other annoyances and breakdowns of the day was just too much. I went into a frenzy and kicked the elevator door 3 times before I realized I was hurting myself more than I was hurting the door. I limped back to the apartment, fuming, slammed the door behind me, grabbed the phone book, and looked up the number of the transit staff. I dialed, prepared to register a complaint so loud they'd be able to hear me in sub-basement 3. I got some more letters that spelled busy. It took 3 tries before I got through to a hurried-looking female receptionist. "My name is Rice," I bellowed. "Edmund Rice. I live on the 153rd floor. I just rang for the elevator and—" "The elevator is disconnected," She said it very rapidly, as though she were growing very used to saying it. It only stopped me for a second. Disconnected? What do you mean, disconnected? Elevators don't get disconnected, I told her. We will resume service as soon as possible, she rattled. My bellowing was bouncing off her like radiation off the Project Force screen. I changed tactics. First, I inhaled, making a production out of it, giving myself the chance to calm down a bit. And then I asked, as rationally as you could please, would you mind terribly telling me why the elevator is disconnected? I am sorry, sir, but that— Stop, I said. I said it quietly, too, but she stopped. I saw her looking at me. She hadn't done that before. She'd merely gazed blankly at her screen and parroted her responses. But now she was actually looking at me. I took advantage of the fact. Calmly, rationally, I said to her, I would like to tell you something, miss. I would like to tell you just what you people have done to me by disconnecting the elevator. You have ruined my life. She blinked, open-mouthed. Ruined your life? Precisely. I found it necessary to inhale again, even more slowly than before. I was on my way, I explained, to propose to a girl whom I dearly love. In every way but one, she is the perfect woman. Do you understand me? She nodded, wide-eyed. I had stumbled on a romantic, though I was too preoccupied to notice it at the time. In every way but one, I continued. She has one small imperfection, a fixation about punctuality. And I was supposed to meet her at 10 o'clock. I'm late. I shook my fist at the screen. Do you realize what you've done, disconnecting the elevator? Not only won't she marry me, she won't even speak to me. Not now, not after this. Sir, she said tremulously, please don't shout. I'm not shouting. Sir, I'm terribly sorry. I understand You understand? I trembled with speechless fury. She looked all about her, and then leaned closer to the screen, revealing a cleavage that I was too distraught at the moment to pay any attention to. We're not supposed to give this information out, sir, she said, her voice low, but I'm going to tell you, so you'll understand why we had to do it. I think it's perfectly awful that it had to ruin things for you this way, but the fact of the matter is, she leaned even closer to the screen, there's a spy in the elevator. 2. It was my turn to be stunned. I just gaped at her. A what? A spy. He was discovered on the 147th floor and managed to get into the elevator before the Army could catch him. He jammed it between floors, but the Army is doing everything it can think of to get him out. Well, but why should there be any problem about getting him out? He plugged in the manual controls. We can't control the elevator from outside at all. And when anyone tries to get into the shaft, he aims the elevator at them. That sounded impossible. He aims the elevator? He runs it up and down the shaft, she explained, trying to crush anybody who goes after him. Oh, I said, so it might take a while. She leaned so close this time that even I, distracted as I was, could hardly help but take note of her cleavage. She whispered, They're afraid they'll have to starve him out. Oh, no. She nodded solemnly. I'm terribly sorry, sir, she said. Then she glanced to her right, suddenly straightened up again, and said, We will resume service as soon as possible. Click. Blank screen. For a minute or two, all I could do was sit and absorb what I'd been told. A spy in the elevator. A spy who had managed to work his way all the way up to the 147th floor before being unmasked. What in the world was the matter with the Army? If things were getting that lax, the project was doomed, force screen or no. Who knew how many more spies there were in the project, still unsuspected? Until that moment, the state of siege in which we all lived had no reality for me. The project, after all, was self-sufficient and completely enclosed. No one ever left, no one ever entered. Under our roof we were a nation, 200 stories high. The ever-present threat of other projects had never been more for me, or for most people either, I suspect, than occasional ore sleds that didn't return, occasional spies shot down as they tried to sneak into the building, occasional spies of our own leaving the project in tiny radiation-proof cars, hoping to get safely within another project and bring back news of any immediate threats and dangers that project might be planning for us. Most spies didn't return. Most ore sleds did. And within the project, life was full, the knowledge of external dangers merely lurking at the backs of our minds. After all, those external dangers had been no more than potential for decades, since what Dr. Kilbally called the ungentlemanly gentleman's war. Dr. Kilbally, Intermediate Project History, when I was 15 years old, had private names for every major war of the 20th century. There was the ignoble nobleman's war, the racial, non-racial war, and the ungentlemanly gentleman's war, known to the textbooks, of course, as World Wars I, II, and III. The rise of the projects, according to Dr. Kilbally, was the result of many, many factors, but two of the most important were the population explosion and the Treaty of Oslo. The population explosion, of course, meant that there was continuously more and more people, but never any more space, so that housing, in the historically short time of the century, made a complete transformation from horizontal expansion to vertical. Before 1900, the vast majority of human beings lived in tiny huts of from 1 to 5 stories. By 2000, everybody lived in projects. From the very beginning, small attempts were made to make these projects more than dwelling places. By mid-century, projects, also called apartments and co-ops, already installed restaurants, shopping centers, babysitting services, dry cleaners, and a host of other adjuncts. By the end of the century, the projects were completely self-sufficient, with food grown hydroponically in the sub-basements, separate floors set aside for schools and churches and factories, robot ore sleds capable of seeking out raw materials unavailable within the projects themselves, and so on. And all because of, among other things, the population explosion and the Treaty of Oslo. It seems there was a power struggle between two sets of then-existing nations. They were something like projects, only horizontal instead of vertical. And both sets were equipped with atomic weapons. The Treaty of Oslo began by stating that atomic war was unthinkable, and added that just in case anybody happened to think of it, only tactical atomic weapons could be used. No strategic atomic weapons. A tactical weapon is something you use on the soldiers, and a strategic weapon is something you use on the folks at home. Oddly enough, when somebody did think of the war, both sides adhered to the Treaty of Oslo, which meant that no projects were bombed. Of course, they made up for this as best they could by using tactical atomic weapons all over the place. After the war, almost the whole world was quite dangerously radioactive, except for the projects, or at least those of them which had in time installed the force screens which had been invented on the very eve of battle and which deflected radioactive particles. However, what with all the other treaties which were broken during the ungentlemanly gentleman's war, by the time it was finished, nobody was quite sure anymore who was on which side. That project over there on the horizon might be an ally, and then again it might not. Since they weren't sure either, it was risky to expose yourself in order to ask. And so life went on, with little to remind us of the dangers lurking outside. The basic policy of eternal vigilance and instant preparedness was left to the Army. The rest of us simply lived our lives and let it go at that. But now, there was a spy in the elevator. When I thought of how deeply he had penetrated our defenses, and of how many others there might be, still penetrating, I shuddered. The walls were our safeguards only so long as all potential enemies were on the other side of them. I sat, shaken, digesting this news, until suddenly I remembered Linda. I leaped to my feet, reading from my watch that it was now 10:15. I dashed once more from the apartment and down the hall to the elevator, praying that the spy had been captured by now, and that Linda would agree with me that a spy in the elevator was good and sufficient reason for me to be late. He was still there. At least the elevator was still out. I sagged against the wall, thinking dismal thoughts. Then I noticed the door to the right of the elevator. Through that door was the stairway. I hadn't paid any attention to it before. No one ever uses the stairs except adventurous young boys playing cops and robbers, running up and down from landing to landing. I myself hadn't set a foot on a flight of stairs since I was 12 years old. Actually, the whole idea of stairs was ridiculous. We had elevators, didn't we? Usually, I mean, when they didn't contain spies. So what was the use of stairs? Well, according to Dr. Kilbilly, a walking library of unnecessary information, the project had been built when there were still such things as municipal governments, something to do with cities, which were more or less grouped projects. And the local municipal government had had on its books a fire ordinance, anachronistic even then, which required a complete set of stairs in every building constructed in the city. Ergo, the project had stairs, 3,200 of them. And now, after all these years, the stairs might prove useful after all. It was only 13 flights to Linda's floor. At 16 steps a flight, that meant 208 steps. Could I descend 208 steps for my true love? I could, if the door would open. It would, though reluctantly. Who knew how many years it had been since this door had been opened? It squeaked and wailed and groaned and finally opened halfway. I stepped through to the musty, dusty landing, took a deep breath, and started down. 8 steps on a landing, 8 steps on a floor, 8 steps on a landing, 8 steps on a floor. On the landing between 150 and 149, there was a smallish door. I paused, looking curiously at it. The letters had long since flaked away, but they left a lighter residue of dust than that which covered the rest of the door, and so the words could still be read, if with difficulty. I read them. They said, "Emergency entrance, elevator shaft, authorized personnel only. Keep locked." I frowned, wondering immediately why this door wasn't being firmly guarded by at least a platoon of army men. Half a dozen possible answers flashed through my mind. The more recent maps might simply have omitted this discarded and unnecessary door. It might be sealed shut on the other side. The army might have caught the spy already. Somebody in authority might simply have goofed. As I stood there pondering these possibilities, the door opened, and the spy came out, waving a gun. 3. He couldn't have been anybody else but the spy. The gun, in the first place. The fact that he looked harried and upset and terribly nervous, in the second place. And, of course, the fact that he came from the elevator shaft. Looking back, I think he must have been just as startled as I was when we came face to face like that. We formed a brief tableau, both of us open-mouthed and wide-eyed. Unfortunately, he recovered first. He closed the emergency door behind him quickly but quietly. His gun stopped waving around and instead pointed directly at my middle. "Don't move," he whispered harshly. "Don't make a sound." I did exactly as I was told. I didn't move, and I didn't make a sound, which left me quite free to study him. He was rather short, perhaps 3 inches shorter than me, with a bony, high-cheekboned face, featuring deep-set eyes and a thin-lipped mouth. He wore gray slacks and a shirt, with brown slippers on his feet. He looked exactly like a spy, which is to say that he didn't look like a spy. He looked overpoweringly ordinary. More than anything else, he reminded me of a rather taciturn milkman who used to make deliveries to my parents' apartment. His gaze darted this way and that. Then he motioned with his free hand at the descending stairs and whispered, "Where do they go?" I had to clear my throat before I could speak. "All the way down," I said. "Good," he said, just as we both heard a sudden raucous squealing from perhaps 4 floors down, a squealing which could be nothing but the opening of a hall door. It was followed by the heavy thud of ascending boots. The army. But if I had any visions of immediate rescue, the spy dashed them. He said, "Where do you live?" 153, I said. This was a desperate and dangerous man. I knew my only slim chance of safety lay in answering his questions promptly, cooperating with him until and unless I saw a chance to either escape or capture him. "All right," he whispered. "Go on." And he prodded me with a gun. And so we went back up the stairs to 153 and stopped at the door. He stood close behind me, the gun pressed against my back, and grated in my ear, "I have this gun in my pocket. If you make one false move, I'll kill you. Now, we're going to your apartment. We're friends, just strolling along together. You got that?" I nodded. "All right, let's go." We went. I have never in my life seen that long hall quite so empty as it was right then. No one came out of any of the apartments, no one emerged from any of the branch halls. We walked to my apartment. I thumbed the door open, and we went inside. Once the door was closed behind us, he visibly relaxed, sagging against the door, his gun hand hanging limp at his side, a nervous smile playing across his lips. I looked at him, judging the distance between us, wondering if I could leap at him before he could bring the gun up again. But he must have read my intentions on my face. He straightened, shaking his head. He said, "Don't try it. I don't want to kill you. I don't want to kill anybody. But I will if I have to. We'll just wait here together until the hue and cry passes us. Then I'll tie you up so you won't be able to sick your army on me too soon, and I'll leave. If you don't try any silly heroics, nothing will happen to you." "You'll never get away," I told him. "The whole project is alerted." "You let me worry about that," he said. He licked his lips. "You got any Chico coffee?" "Yes." "Make me a cup. And don't get any bright ideas about dousing me with boiling water." "I only have my day's allotment," I protested. "Just enough for 2 cups, lunch and dinner." "2 cups is fine," he said. "One for each of us." And now I had another grudge against this blasted spy. Which reminded me again of Linda. From the looks of things, I wasn't ever going to get to her place. By now, she was probably in mourning for me and might even have the sanitation staff searching for my remains. As I made the Chico, he asked me questions. My name first, and then, "What do you do for a living?" I thought fast. "I'm an ore sled dispatcher," I said. That was a lie, of course, but I'd heard enough about ore sled dispatching from Linda to be able to maintain the fiction should he question me further about it. Actually, I was a gymnast instructor. The subjects I taught included wrestling, judo, and karate, talents I would prefer to disclose to him in my own fashion when the time came. He was quiet for a moment. "What about radiation level on the ore sleds?" I had no idea what he was talking about and admitted as much. "When they come back," he said, "how much radiation do they pick up? Don't you people ever test them?" "Of course not," I told him. I was on secure ground now, with Linda's information to guide me. "All radiation is cleaned from the sleds and their cargo before they're brought into the building." "I know that," he said impatiently. "But don't you ever check them before deradiating them?" "No, why should we?" "To find out how far the radiation level outside has dropped." "For what? Who cares about that?" He frowned bitterly. "The same answer," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "The same answer every time. You people have crawled into your caves, and you're ready to stay in them forever." I looked around at my apartment. "Rather a well-appointed cave," I told him. "But a cave, nevertheless." He leaned toward me, his eyes gleaming with a fanatical flame. "Don't you ever wish to get outside?" Incredible. I nearly poured boiling water all over myself. Outside? Of course not. "The same thing," he grumbled, "over and over again. Always the same stupidity. Listen, you. Do you realize how long it took man to get out of the caves? The long, slow, painful creep of progress, for millennia before he ever made that first step from the caves?" "I have no idea," I told him. "I'll tell you this," he said belligerently. "A lot longer than it took for him to turn around and go back into the cave again." He started pacing the floor, waving the gun around in an agitated fashion as he talked. "Is this the natural life of man? It is not. Is this even a desirable life for man? It is definitely not." He spun back to face me, pointing the gun at me again, but this time he pointed it as though it were a finger, not a gun. "Listen, you," he snapped. "Man was progressing. For all his stupidities and excesses, he was growing up. His dreams were getting bigger and grander and better all the time. He was planning to tackle space. The moon first, and then the planets, and finally the stars. The whole universe was out there, waiting to be plucked like an apple from a tank. And man was reaching out for it." He glared as though daring me to doubt it. I decided that this man was doubly dangerous. Not only was he a spy, he was also a lunatic. So I had 2 reasons for humoring him. I nodded politely. "So what happened?" he demanded, and immediately answered himself. "I'll tell you what happened. Just as he was about to make that first giant step, man got a hot foot. That's all it was, just a little hot foot. So what did man do? I'll tell you what he did. He turned around and he ran all the way back to the cave he started from, his tail between his legs. That's what he did." To say that all this was incomprehensible would be an extreme understatement. I fulfilled my obligation to this insane dialogue by saying, "Here's your coffee." "Put it on the table," he said, switching instantly from raving maniac to watchful spy. I put it on the table. He drank deep, then carried the cup across the room and sat down in my favorite chair. He studied me narrowly and suddenly said, "What did they tell you I was? A spy?" "Of course," I said. He grinned bitterly with one side of his mouth. "Of course. The damn fools. Spy. What do you suppose I'm going to spy on?" He asked the question so violently and urgently that I knew I had to answer quickly and well. The maniac would return. I wouldn't know exactly," I stammered. "Military equipment, I suppose." "Military equipment? What military equipment? Your army is supplied with uniforms, whistles, and handguns, and that's about it." "The defenses," I started. "The defenses," he interrupted me, "are non-existent. If you mean the rocket launches on the roof, they've rusted through with age. And what other defenses are there? None." "If you say so," I replied stiffly. The Army claimed that we had adequate defense equipment. I chose to believe the Army over an enemy spy. "Your people send out spies too, don't they?" he demanded. "Well, of course." "And what are they supposed to spy on?" Well, it was such a pointless question it seemed silly even to answer it. "They're supposed to look for indications of an attack by one of the other projects." "And did they find any indications? Ever?" "I'm sure I don't know," I told him frostily. "That would be classified information." "You bet it would," he said with malicious glee. "All right. If that's what your spies are doing, and I'm a spy, then it follows that I'm doing the same thing, right?" "I don't follow you," I admitted. "If I'm a spy," he said impatiently, "then I'm supposed to look for indications of an attack by your people on my project." I shrugged. "If that's your job," I said, "then that's your job." He got suddenly red-faced and jumped to his feet. "That's not my job, you blatant idiot," he shouted. "I'm not a spy. If I were a spy, that would be my job." The maniac had returned in full force. "All right," I said hastily. "All right, whatever you say." He glowered at me for a moment longer, then shouted, "Bah!" and dropped back into the chair. He breathed rather heavily for a while, glaring at the floor, then looked at me again. "All right, listen. What if I were to tell you that I had found indications that you people were planning to attack my project?" I stared at him. "That's impossible," I cried. "We aren't planning to attack anybody. We just want to be left in peace." "How do I know that?" he demanded. "It's the truth. What would we want to attack anybody for?" "Aha!" He sat forward, tensed, pointing the gun at me like a finger again. "Now then," he said, "if you know it doesn't make any sense for this project to attack any other project, then why in the world should you think they might see some advantage in attacking you?" I shook my head, dumbfounded. "I can't answer a question like that," I said. "How do I know what they're thinking?" "They're human beings, aren't they?" he cried. "Like you, like me, like all the other people in this mausoleum. Now, wait a minute." "No," he shouted. "You wait a minute. I want to tell you something. You think I'm a spy. That blundering army of yours thinks I'm a spy. That fathead who turned me in thinks I'm a spy. But I'm not a spy, and I'm going to tell you what I am." I waited, looking as attentive as possible. "I come," he said, "from a project about 80 miles north of here. I came here by foot, without any sort of radiation shield at all to protect me." The maniac was back. I didn't say a word. I didn't want to set off the violence that was so obviously in this lunatic. "The radiation level," he went on, "is way down. It's practically as low as it was before the atom war. I don't know how long it's been that low, but I would guess about 10 years at the very least." He leaned forward again, urgent and serious. The world is safe out there now. Man can come back out of the cave again. He can start building the dreams again. And this time he can build better, because he has the horrible example of the recent past to guide him away from the pitfalls. There's no need any longer for the projects." And that was like saying there's no need any more for stomachs, but I didn't say so. I didn't say anything at all. "I'm a trained atomic engineer," he went on, "in my project. I worked on the reactor. Theoretically, I believe that there was a chance the radiation outside was lessening by now, though we had no idea exactly how much radiation had been released by the atom war. But I wanted to test the theory, and the Commission wouldn't let me. They claimed public safety, but I knew better. If the outside were safe and the projects were no longer needed, then the Commission was out of a job, and they knew it. Well, I went ahead with the test anyway, and I was caught at it. For my punishment, I was banned from the project. They kicked me out, telling me if I thought it was safe outside, I could live outside, and if it really was safe, I could come back and tell them. Except that they also made it clear that I would be shot if I tried to get back in, because I would be carrying deadly radiation. He smiled bitterly. "They had it all their own way," he said. "But it is safe out there. I'm living proof of it. I lived outside for 5 months, and gradually I realized I had to tell others. I had to spread the word that man could have his world back. I didn't dare try to get back into my own project. I would have been recognized and shot before I could say a word. So I came here." He paused to finish the cup of Chico that I should have had with lunch. "I knew better," he continued, "than to simply walk into the building and announce that I came from outside. Man has an instinctive distrust for strangers anyway. The projects only intensify it. Once again, I would have been shot. So I've been working in a more devious way. I snuck into the project. Not a difficult thing for a man with no metal on his person, no radiation shield cocooning him. And for the last 2 months, I've been wandering around the building and talking with people. I strike up a conversation. I try to plant a few seeds of doubt about the deadliness of outside, and I hope that at least a few of the people I talk to begin to wonder, as I once did." 2 months? This spy, by his own admission, had been in the project 2 months before being detected. I'd never heard of such a thing, and I hoped I'd never hear of such a thing again. "Things have worked out pretty well," he said, "until today. I said something wrong. I'm still not sure what. And the man I was talking to hollered for army, shouted I was a spy." He pounded the chair arm. "But I'm not a spy, and it's the truth. Outside is safe." He glared suddenly at the window. "Why have you got that drape up there?" "The window broke down," I explained. "It's stuck at transparent." "Transparent? Fine." He got up from the chair, strode across the room, and ripped the drape down from the window. I cowered away from the sun glare, turning my back to the window. "Come over here," he shouted. When I didn't move, he snarled, "Get up, come over here, or I swear I'll shoot." And he would have. It was plain in his voice. I got to my feet, hesitant, and walked trembling to the window, squinting against the glare. "Look out there," he ordered. "Look." I looked. 4. Terror, horror, dizziness, nausea. Far and away and far, nothing and nothing, only the glare and the high blue and the far, far horizon and the broken gray slag stretching out way down below. "Do you see?" he demanded. "Look down there. We're so high up it's hard to see, but look for it. Do you see it? Do you see the green? Do you know what that means? There are green things growing again outside. Not much yet. It's only started back, but it's begun. The radiation is down. Plants are growing again." The power of suggestion, and of course the heightened sensitivity caused by the double threat of a man beside me carrying a gun and that yawning, aching expanse of nothing beyond the window. I nearly fancied that I did see faint specks of green. "Do you see it?" he asked me. "Wait," I said. I leaned closer to the window, though every nerve in me wanted to leap the other way. "Yes," I said. "Yes, I see it. Green." He sighed, a long, painful sigh of thanksgiving. "Then now you know," he said. "I've been telling you the truth. It is safe outside." And my lie worked. For the first time his guard was completely down. I moved like a whirlwind. I leaped and twisted his arm in a hard hammerlock, which caused him to cry out and drop the gun. That was wrestling. Then I turned and twisted and dipped, causing him to fly over my head and crash to the floor. That was judo. Then I jabbed one rigid forefinger against a certain spot on the side of his neck, causing the blood in his veins to forever stop its motion. That was karate. Well, by the time the army men had finished questioning me, it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I was 5 hours late. The army men corroborated my belief that the man had been a spy who had apparently lost his mind when cornered in the elevator. Outside was still dangerous, of course, they assured me of that. And he'd been lying about having been here 2 months. He'd been in the project less than 2 days. Not only that, the army men told me they'd found the radiation-proof car he'd driven, and in which he'd hoped to drive back to his own project once he'd discovered all our defenses. Despite the fact that I had the most legitimate excuse for tardiness under the roof, Linda refused to forgive me for not making our 10 o'clock meeting. When I asked her to marry me, she refused, at length and descriptively. But I was surprised and relieved to discover how rapidly I got over my heartbreak. This was aided by the fact that once the news of my exploits spread, there were any number of girls more than anxious to get to know me better, including the well-cleavaged young lady from the transit staff. After all, I was a hero. They even gave me a medal.
The Venus Trap by Evelyn E. Smith. Recording by Rebecca Nemethy. One thing man never counted on to take along into space with him was the eternal triangle, especially a true blue triangle like this. "What's the matter, darling?" James asked anxiously. "Don't you like the planet?" "Oh, I love the planet," Phyllis said. "It's beautiful." It was. The blue, really blue grass, blue-violet shrubbery, and, loveliest of all, the great golden tree with sapphire leaves and pale pink blossoms, instead of looking alien, resembled nothing so much as a fairy tale version of Earth. Even the fragrance that filled the atmosphere was completely delightful to terrestrial nostrils, which was unusual, for most other planets, no matter how well adapted for colonization otherwise, tended, from the human viewpoint anyway, to stink. Not that they were not colonized nevertheless, for the population of Earth was expanding at too great a rate to permit merely olfactory considerations to rule out an otherwise suitable planet. This particular group of settlers had been lucky, indeed, to have drawn a planet as pleasing to the nose as to the eye, and, moreover, free from hostile aborigines. As a matter of fact, the only apparent evidence of animate life were the small, bright-hued creatures winging back and forth through the clear air, and which resembled terrestrial birds so closely that there seemed no point to giving them any other name. There were insects, too, although not immediately perceptible, but the ones like bees were devoid of stings, and the butterflies never had to pass through the grub stage but were born in the fullness of their beauty. However, fairest of all creatures on the planet to James Hott, just then anyhow, was his wife, and the expression on her face was not a lovely one. "You do feel all right, don't you?" he asked. "The light gravity gets some people at first." "Yes, I guess I'm all right. I'm still a little shaken, though, and you know, it's not the gravity." He would have liked to take her in his arms and say something comforting, reassuring, but the constraint between them had not yet been worn off. Although he had sent her an ethergram nearly every day of the voyage, the necessarily public nature of the messages had kept them from achieving communication in the deeper sense of the word. "Well, I suppose you did have a bit of a shock," he said lamely. "Somehow I thought I had told you in my grams." "You told me plenty in the grams, but not quite enough, it seems." Her words didn't seem to make sense. The strain had evidently been a little too much. "Maybe you ought to go inside and lie down for a while." "I will, just as soon as I feel less wobbly." She brushed back the long, light brown hair which had got tumbled when she fainted. He remembered a golden rather than reddish tinge in it, but that had been under the yellow sun of Earth. Under the scarlet sun of this planet, it took on a different beauty. "How come the preliminary team didn't include it in their report?" she asked, avoiding his appreciative eye. They didn't know. We didn't find out ourselves until we sent that first message to Earth. I suppose by the time we did relay the news, you were on your way. Yes, that must have been it. The preliminary exploration team had established the fact that the planet was more or less Earth-type, that its air was breathable, its temperature agreeably spring-like, its mineral composition very similar to Earth's, with only slight traces of unknown elements, that there was plenty of drinkable water and no threatening life forms. Human beings could, therefore, live on it. It remained for the scout team to determine whether human beings would want to live on it, whether, in fact, they themselves would want to, because if so, they had the option of becoming the first settlers. That was the way the system worked, and in the main, it worked well enough. After less than 2 weeks, the scout team had beamed back to Earth the message that the planet was suitable for colonization, so suitable that they would like to give it the name of Elysium. If there was no objection. There would be none, Earth had replied, so long as the pioneers bore in mind the fact that 6 other planets had previously been given that name, and a human colony currently existed on only one of those. No need to worry about a conflict of nomenclature, however, because the name of that other planet, Elysium, had subsequently been changed by unanimous vote of settlers to Hades. After this somewhat sinister piece of information, Earth had added the more cheerful news that the wives and families of the scouts would soon be on their way, bringing with them the tools and implements necessary to transform the wilderness of the frontier into another Earth. In the meantime, the men were to set up the package buildings, with which all scout ships were equipped, so that when the women came, homes would be ready for them. The men set to work, and before the month was out, they discovered that Elysium was neither a wilderness nor a frontier. It was populated by an intelligent race, which had developed its culture to the limit of its physical abilities. Actually, well beyond the limit of what the astounded terrestrials could have conceived its physical abilities to be, then, owing to unavoidable disaster, had started to die out. The remaining natives were perspicacious enough to see in the terrestrials' coming not a threat but a last hope of reviving their own moribund species. Accordingly, the Earthmen were encouraged to go ahead building on the sites originally selected, the only ban being on the type of construction materials used, and a perfectly reasonable one under the circumstances. James had built his cottage near the largest, handsomest tree in the area allotted to him. Since there were no hostile life forms, there was no need for a closely knit community. Everyone who had seen it agreed that his house was the most attractive one of all, for although it was only a standard prefab, he had used taste and ingenuity to make it a little different from the other unimaginative homes. And now Phyllis, for whom he had performed all this labor of love, for whom he had waited 5 long months, the tedium of which had been broken only by the intellectual pleasure of teaching English to a sympathetic native neighbor, Phyllis seemed unappreciative. She had hardly looked at the inside of the cottage when he had shown her through, and now was staring at the outside in a blank sort of way. The indoctrination courses had not, he reflected, reconciled her to the frontiersman's necessarily simple mode of living, which was ironic, considering that one of her original attractions for him had been her apparent suitability for the pioneer life. She was a big girl, radiantly healthy, even though a little green at the moment. He just managed to keep his voice steady. "You don't like the house, is that it?" "But I do like it, honestly I do." She touched his arm diffidently. "Everything would be perfect if only—" "If only what? Is it the curtains? I'm sorry if you don't like them. I brought them all the way from Earth in case the planet turned out to be habitable. I thought blue was your favorite color." "Oh, it is! It is! I'm mad about the curtains." Perhaps it wasn't the house that disappointed her. Perhaps it was he himself who hadn't lived up to the dim memory and ardent expectation. "If you want to know what is bothering me," she glanced up apprehensively, lowering her voice as she did, "it's that tree. It's stuck on you. I just know it is." He laughed. "Now where did you get a preposterous idea like that, Phil? You've been on the planet exactly 24 hours, and I have, in my luggage, 132 ethergrams talking about practically nothing but Magnolia this and Magnolia that. Oh, I had my suspicions even before I landed, James. The only thing I didn't suspect was that she was a tree." "What are you talking about, honey? Magnolia and I, we're just friends." "Purely a platonic relationship, I assure you," the tree herself agreed. It would have been silly for her to pretend not to have overheard, since the two were still standing almost directly underneath her. Purely platonic. "She's more like a sister to me," James tried to explain. Phyllis stiffened. "Frankly, if I had imagined I was going to have a tree for a sister-in-law, I would have thought before I married you, James." Bursting into tears, she ran inside the cottage. "Sorry," he said miserably to Magnolia. "It's a long trip out from Earth, and an uncomfortable one. I don't suppose the other women were especially nice to her either. Faculty wives mostly, and you know how they are. No, I don't suppose you would, but she shouldn't have acted that way toward you." "Not your fault," Magnolia told him, sighing with such intensity that he could feel the humidity rise. "I know how you've been looking forward to her arrival. Rather a letdown, isn't it?" "Oh, I'm sure it'll be all right." He tried to sound confident. "And I know you'll like Phyllis when you get to know her." "Possibly, but so far I'm afraid I must admit, since there never has been any pretense between us, that she is a bit of a disappointment. I, and my sisters also, had expected your females when they came to be as upright and true blue as you. Instead, what are they? Shrubs." The door to the cottage flew open. "A shrub, am I?" Phyllis brandished an axe, which James winced to recall was an item of the equipment he had ordered from Earth before the scout team had learned that the trees were intelligent. "I'll shrub you." "Phyllis!" He wrested the axe from her grip. "That would be murder." "Woodman, as the terrestrial poem goes," the tree remarked. "Spare that tree, touch not a single bough. In youth it sheltered me, and I'll protect it now." Good of her to take the whole thing so calmly. Rather, to pretend to take it so calmly, for he knew how sensitive Magnolia really was, but he was afraid this show of moral courage would not diminish Phyllis's dislike for her. Those without self-control seldom appreciate those who have it. "If you'll excuse us," he said, putting his arm around his wife's heaving shoulders, "I'd better see to Phyllis. She's a little upset. Holdover from space sickness, I expect. Poor girl, she's a long way from home and frightened." "I understand, Jim," Magnolia told him. "And remember, whatever happens, you can always count on me." "I must say, you're not a very admirable representative of terrestrial womanhood," James snapped as soon as the door had slammed behind him and his wife, leaving them alone in the principal room of the cottage. "Insulting the very first native you meet." "I did not either insult her. All I said was, what beautiful flowers. Do you suppose the fruit is edible? How was I to know she could understand? Naturally, I wouldn't dream of eating her fruit now. It would probably taste nasty anyway. And how do you think I felt when a tree answered me back? You don't care that I fainted dead away, and I've never fainted before in my life. All you care about is that old vegetable's feelings. It was bad enough, feeling for 5 months that someone had come between us, but to find out it wasn't someone, but something?" "Phyllis," he said coldly, "I'll thank you to keep a civil tongue in your head." Dropping into the overstuffed chair, his wife dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "She wasn't so very polite to me." "Look, Phyllis." He strove to make his voice calm, adult, reasonable. "You happen to have hit on a rather touchy point with her. Those trees are dioecious, you know, like us. And she isn't mated. And, well, she has rather a lot of xylem zones. Rings, you know. Are you trying to tell me she's old?" "Well, she's no sapling anymore. And consideration aside, you should know it's government policy for us to establish good relations with any intelligent life form we have to share a planet with. You weren't in there trying." Phyllis put away her handkerchief with what he hoped would be a final sniff. "I suppose I shouldn't have acted that way," she conceded. "Now you're talking like my own dear Phyllis," James said tenderly, though as a matter of fact, he had a very remote idea of what his own dear Phyllis was like. He had met her only a couple of months before the scout mission was scheduled, and so their courtship had been brief, and the actual weeks of marriage even briefer. He had remembered Phyllis as beautiful. She was beautiful. He had not, however, remembered her as pig-headed, and pig-headed she was, too. "How come she hasn't a mate? I didn't think trees were choosy." He wouldn't take exception to that statement, uncharitable though it was. After all, someone whose only acquaintance with trees had been the terrestrial variety would naturally be incapable of appreciating the total tree at its highest development. "It's a great tragedy," he told her in a hushed tone. "There was a blight some years back, and most of the male trees died off. Except for a few on the other side of the planet. Well, out of bee-shot. Even if the females there would let the females here have any pollen, which they absolutely won't." "I don't blame them," Phyllis said coldly. Of course she would identify at once with the trees whose domestic lives seemed to be threatened. "It's not that so much. It's that the male trees produce so little pollen." "This would be a good place for people with hay fever then, wouldn't it?" "And even when there is fruit, so much of it tends to be parthenocarpous. No seeds," he sighed. "The entire race is dying out." "How is it you know so much about botany?" she asked suspiciously. "It's not your field." "I don't know so very much, really," he smiled. "I had to learn a little if I wanted to work the land, so I borrowed an elementary text from Cutler." Had he been a trifle idealistic in quitting his snug, if uninspiring, job on the faculty to join in this utopian venture? So many of the other men at the university had enrolled. It had seemed a splendid idea until Phyllis's arrival. "Daddy never had any trouble working his land, and he doesn't know a thing about botany. You've been boning up on it just to please her." "Phyllis, how can you jump to conclusions without a shred of evidence?" Not that she wouldn't be able to collect such evidence later, because the allegation happened to be correct. "If instead of coming to Elysium I had merely gone to China, would she have thought it so odd that I studied Chinese? Then why, where the natives are trees, shouldn't I study botany? The woman is unreasonable." "And will her people let you farm?" Now he could show her how cogently and comprehensively he could answer a logical question. "That aspect of the situation will be all right, dear, because only the trees are an intelligent species, and even of them some aren't so bright. They won't have any more objection to our eating the other fruit and vegetables than we would have to an extraterrestrial's eating our eggs and chickens, for example. We're going to try to introduce some earth plants here, though, as the higher forms of vegetation are dying out, and we're afraid the lower might follow. Pity it's too late for a sound conservation program." Phyllis said grimly. "She doesn't think it's too late for a sound conservation program. She still has hopes. Far-fetched, maybe. And I'm not so sure they are. Mark my words, James. She's got designs on you." "Don't be idiotic," he protested. "That would be—" He attempted to introduce a light note. "It would be miscegenation." "These foreigners can't be expected to have our standards." And she burst into tears again. "A fine thing to go through that miserable 5-month trip, only to find out a tree has alienated my husband's affections." "Oh, come on, Phil." He still was trying for a smile. "What would a tree see in me?" "I'm beginning to wonder what I saw in you. You never loved me. You just wanted a wife to come out and colonize with you and breed." What could he say? It was almost true. Phyllis was a beautiful girl, and he loved her, but if he had planned to remain as an instructor with the Romance Languages Department instead of joining the Scout mission, he knew he would never have asked her to be his wife. For her sake, of course, as well as his own. He should say something to reassure her, but the words wouldn't come. "I don't like it here," Phyllis sobbed. "I don't like the blue leaves. I don't like the blue grass. I like them green, the way they're supposed to be. I hate this nasty planet. It's all wrong. I want to go home." She was very young, less than 8 years younger than he, true, but he was mature for his age. They didn't know each other very well, and, finally, there were more men than women on the planet, and he had noticed that the bachelors had seemed readily disposed, upon her arrival the day before, to overlook the fact that she had no college degree. So he must be patient with her. "There's nothing wrong about it, dear. The plants here synthesize cyanophyll instead of chlorophyll. That's why the leaves are blue instead of green. And, of course, there are different minimal constitutes of the soil, more aluminum and copper, for instance, than on Earth, and some elements we haven't quite isolated yet. So, you see, they're bound to be a little different from terrestrial trees." "A little different I wouldn't mind," she said sulkily. "But they're a lot different without being nearly alien enough." "Look, Phyllis, Dear, those trees have been very hospitable, very kind. We owe them a lot. They themselves suggested that we come here and live with them in, so to speak, symbiosis. That's a fine idea. He beamed. I knew you'd understand after I had explained it to you. We provide the brains and they provide the furniture. Phyllis, what a thing to say. I've heard of man-eating trees before. I suppose there could be man-loving ones, too. Phyllis, these trees are as gentle and sweet as... He didn't know how he could explain it to her. No one who had ever been friends with a tree could appreciate the true beauty of the xylemic character. Why, we even offered to go over to the other side of the planet and fetch some pollen for them, but they wouldn't hear of it. Unfortunately, they'd rather die than be mated to anyone they had never met. What a perfectly disgusting idea. I don't think so. Trees can be idealistic. You fetching pollen for her, I mean. Naturally, she wouldn't want pollen from a tree on the other side of the planet. She wants you. Don't be silly. Incompatibility usually exists between the pollen of one species and the stigmata of another. Besides, he added patiently, I haven't got pollen. You'd better not, or it won't be her who will have the stigmata. Phyllis, he sat down on the arm of her chair and tried to embrace her. You know that you're the only life form I love. Please, James, she pushed him away. I guess I love you too, in spite of everything, but I don't want to make a public spectacle of myself. What do you mean now? That tree would know everything that goes on. She's telepathic. Where did you get a ridiculous idea like that? What kind of rubbish have you been reading? All right, tell me, how else did she learn to speak such good English? It's because she's of a very high order of intelligence. And I suppose, he laughed modestly, because I'm such a good teacher. I don't care how good a teacher you are. A tree couldn't learn to speak a language so well in 5 months. She must be telepathic. It's the only explanation. Give her time, the tree advised later, as James came out on the lawn to talk to his only friend on the planet. He hadn't seen much of the other scouts since the house-building frenzy had started, and visits among the men had decreased. The base camp, where the bachelors and the older married couples lived, was located a good distance away from his land, for he had raised his honeymoon cottage far from the rest. He had wanted to have his Phyllis all to himself. In the idyll he had visualized for the two of them, she would need no company but his. Little had he imagined that, within 24 hours of her arrival, he would be looking for company himself. I suppose so, he said, kicking at a root. Oh, I'm sorry, Maggie. I didn't think. That's all right, Magnolia said bravely. It didn't really hurt. That female's got you all upset, you poor boy. James muttered a feeble defense of his wife. Jim, forgive me if I speak frankly, the tree went on, in a low rustle. But do you think she's really worthy of you? Of course she is. Surely on your planet you could have found a mate more admirable, high-minded, exemplary, more, in short, like yourself. Or are all the human females inferior specimens like Phyllis? She suits me, James said doggedly. Of course. It's very noble of you to defend her. You would have disappointed me if you had said anything else. I honor you for it, James. He kicked at one of the pebbles. The tree meant well, he knew, yet like so many well-meaning friends, she succeeded only in dispiriting him. It was almost like being back at the faculty club. I don't suppose a clod like her would have brought any more books along. The tree changed the subject. James's own library had been insufficient to slake the tree's intellectual thirst, so he had gone all over the planet to borrow books for Magnolia. Dr. Lakin, at base, who had formerly taught English literature, possessed the fine collection which he had been reluctant to lend until he had learned that they were not for James, but for a tree. At that, he had fetched the books himself, since he was anxious to meet her. A lot of the trees here have learned the English language, he had told James, but none seems to have developed a taste for its literature. Your magnolia is undoubtedly a superior specimen. Excellent natural taste, too. Perhaps a little unformed when it comes to poetry and the more sophisticated aspects of life, but she'll learn. Unfortunately, the same, James knew, could hardly be said of his wife. Phyllis did bring some books, he told Magnolia. For you, no doubt. That was kind of her. I'm sure she has many good qualities which will unfold one by one, as her merry stems start differentiating. I hope you don't feel I've been too, well, personal, Jim. I was only trying to help. If I've gone too far... Of course not, Maggie. After all, he laughed bitterly, I do know you better than I know her. We have been good friends, haven't we, Jim? It was rather nice, those 5 months we spent alone together. For the first time in my life, I have never regretted being so far from my sisters. And this our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. Her blue leaves shone violet in the scarlet rays of the setting sun. The gold of her trunk was lit with red radiance. She was the most beautiful creature he had ever seen. But she was a tree, not a woman. I'm sure she'll fit in after a while, Magnolia continued. Perhaps she isn't well. She seems to guttate an awful lot. Do you suppose she's been overwatered? That wasn't guttation, James said heavily. It was tears. It means she's unhappy. Unhappy? Perhaps she won't fit in on this planet, in which case she should by all means go back to Earth. It's cruel and unfair to keep an intelligent, loosely speaking, life form anywhere against her will, don't you think? She'll be happy here, James vowed. I'll make her happy. Well, I certainly hope you can manage it. By the way, do you suppose you'll have a chance to read me the books she brought, or will she be keeping you too busy? I'll never be too busy to read to you, Magnolia. That's very nitrogenous of you, Jim. Our intellectual communions have meant a lot to me. I'd hate to have to give them up. So would I, he said. But there won't be any need to. Phyllis will understand. I certainly hope so. I so admire your English literature. It's so deeply cognizant of the really meaningful things in life. And if your coming to this planet has served only to add poetry to our cultural heritage, it would be reason enough to welcome you with open limbs. For it was truly a perceptive versifier who wrote the immortally simple lines. Poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. And such a charming tune to go with it, too, Magnolia went on. We have always sung the music that the wind and the rain have taught us, but until you came, we never thought of putting words and melody together to form one glorious whole. A tree that may in summer wear, she caroled in a pleasing contralto, a nest of robins in her hair. By the way, Jim, ever since reading that poem, I've been meaning to ask you precisely what are robins, and do you think they'd look well in my hair? By which I suppose the bard refers in somewhat pedestrian flight of fancy to leaves? They're a kind of bird, he said drearily. Birds nesting in my hair. I wouldn't think of allowing it. But then I suppose terrestrial birds are quite different from ours. More housebroken, shall we say? Everything's different, James said, and for an irrational moment he hated everything that was blue and should have been green, everything sweet that should have been vicious, everything intelligent that should have been mindless. Since matters could not grow much worse, they improved to a degree. After a day or two had passed, Phyllis, being a conscientious girl, came to realize how wrong it had been for her as a terrestrial immigrant to show overt hostility toward a native of the planet that had welcomed her. But how could she be a person? Phyllis wanted to know when they were inside the cottage, for she had learned to hold her tongue when they were near Magnolia or any of her sisters, who, though they could not speak the language as fluently as she, understood it very well, and eavesdropped at every possible opportunity in order, they said, to improve their accents. She's a tree, a plant, and plants are just vegetables. She stabbed her needle energetically through the tablecloth she was embroidering. You mustn't project terrestrial attitudes upon Elysian ones, James said, patiently looking up from his book. And don't underestimate Magnolia's capabilities. She has sense organs, and motor organs, too. She can't move from where she is because she's rooted to the ground, but she's capable of turgor movements, like certain terrestrial forms of vegetation, for example, the sensitive plant, or bluegrass. Bluegrass, Phyllis exclaimed. I'm sick of bluegrass. I want green grass. However, these trees have conscious control of their pulvini, whereas the Earth's plants don't, and so they can do a lot of things that Earth plants can't. It sounds like a dirty word to me. Pulvini merely means motor organs. Oh. He closed his book, which was a more advanced botany text, covered with the jacket of a French novel in order to spare Phyllis's feelings. Darling, can't you get it through your pretty head that they're intelligent life forms? If it'll make it easier for you to think of them as human beings who happen to look like trees, then do that. That's exactly what I am doing, and I'm quite sure she thinks of you as a tree who happens to look like a human being. Phyllis, sometimes I think you're being deliberately difficult. Do you know one of the reasons why I took such pains to teach Magnolia English? It was that I hoped she would be a companion for you, that you could talk to each other when I had to be away from home. Why do you call her Magnolia? She isn't a lot like one. Isn't she? I thought she was. You see, I don't know so much about botany after all. Actually, he had picked that name for the tree because it expressed both the arboreal and the feminine at the same time, and also because it was one of the loveliest names he knew. But he couldn't tell Phyllis that. There would be further misunderstanding. Of course, she has a name in her own language, but I can't pronounce it. They do have a language of their own, then. Naturally, though they don't get much chance to speak it since they've grown so few and far apart that verbal communication has become difficult. They communicate by a network of roots that they've developed. I don't think that's so clever. I merely said, oh, what's the use of trying to explain everything to you? You just don't want to understand. Phyllis put down her needlework and closed her eyes. James, she said, opening them again, it's no use pretending. I've been trying to be sympathetic and understanding, but I can't do it. That tree, I've forced myself to be nice to her, but the more I see of her, the more convinced I am that she's trying to steal you from me. Phyllis was beginning to poison his mind, he thought, because it seemed to him also, in his last conversation with Magnolia, that he had discerned more than ordinary warmth in her attitude toward him. And perhaps a trace of spite toward his wife? Preposterous. The tree had only been trying to cheer him up, as any friend might reasonably do. After all, a tree and a man... Nonsense. One had an anabolic metabolism, one a catabolic. But this was a different kind of tree. She spoke, she read, she was capable of conscious turgor movements. And he had often thought secretly, was a different kind of man. Whereas Phyllis... But that was disloyalty. To the type as well as the individual. The tree could be a companion to him, but she could not give him sons to work his land. She could not give him daughters to populate his planet. Moreover, she could not possibly know what human love meant, while Phyllis could at least learn. Look, dear, he said, sitting down beside his wife on the couch and taking her hand in his. She didn't draw away this time. Suppose what you're saying is true. Not that it is, of course. Just because the tree has a crush on me doesn't mean I necessarily have a crush on her, does it? His wife looked up at him, her rose-red lips parted, her moss-gray eyes shining. Oh, if only I could believe that, James. Anyhow, she doesn't know what the whole thing's about. Poor kid. Poor kid? Phyllis, you know you're prettier than any tree. That was not literally true, but reason was useless. He had to make his point in terms she could understand. And remember, she's got a lot of rings. She must be centuries old, while you're only 19. 20, Phyllis corrected. I had a birthday on the ship. Well, you certainly must allow me to wish you a happy birthday, darling. She was in his arms at last. He was about to kiss her, and the trees seemed very remote when she drew back. But are you sure she can't be watching us? Darling, I swear it. Lady by yonder blessed moon, I swear, that tips with silver all these fruit tree tops. But he had sense enough not to say it, and Elysium had not one blessed moon, but 3, and everything was all right. For a while, anyway. I see your wife is developing a corm. the tree remarked as James paused for a chat. He hadn't much time to be sociable those days, for there was such a lot of work to be done, so many preparations to be made, so many things to be requisitioned from Earth. The supply ships were beginning to come now, bringing necessities and an occasional luxury for those who could afford it. "She's pregnant," James explained. "Happened before I left Earth." "How do you mean?" "She's about to fruit. Didn't I read that zoology book to you?" "Yes, but... Oh, James, it all seems so vulgar. To fruit without ever having bloomed. How squalid." "It all depends on how you look at it," he said. That is, we, had hoped that when the baby came, you would be godmother to it. You know what that is, don't you?" "Of course I do. You read Cinderella to me. I know it's a great honor, but I'm afraid I must decline." "Why? I thought you were our friend." "Jim, there's something I must confess. My feelings toward you are not merely those of a friend. Although Phyllis doesn't have too many rings of intellect, she is a female, so she knew all along." Magnolia's leaves rustled diffidently. "I feel toward you the way I never felt toward any intelligent life form, but only toward the sun, the soil, the rain. I sense a tropism that seems to incline me toward you. In fact, I'm afraid, Jim, in your own terms, I love you." "But you're a tree. You can't love me in my own terms because trees can't love in the way people can. And, of course, people can't love like trees. We belong to two entirely different species, Maggie. You can't have listened to that zoology book very attentively." "Our race is a singularly adaptable one, or we wouldn't have survived so long, Jim, or gone so far in our particular direction. It's lack of fertility, not lack of enterprise, that's responsible for our decline. And I think your species must be an adaptable one, too. You just haven't really tried. Oh, James, let us reverse the classical roles. Let me be the Apollo to your Daphne. Don't let Phyllis stand in our way. The Greek gods never let a little thing like marriage interfere with their plans." "But I love Phyllis," he said in confusion. "I love you too," he added, "but in a different way." "Yes, I know. More like a sister. However, I have plenty of sisters, and I don't need a brother." "We're starting a conservation program," he tried to comfort her. "We have every hope of getting some pollen from the other side of the planet, once we've explained to the trees there how far we can make a little go, and you've got to accept it. You mustn't be silly about it." "It isn't the same thing, Jim, and you know it. One of the penalties of intelligence is the diffusiveness of the natural instincts." "I would rather not fruit at all, then." "Magnolia, you just don't understand. No matter how much you, pursue me, I can never turn into a laurel tree. I didn't. Or any kind of tree. Look, some more books were just sent over from base." Magnolia gave a rueful rustle. "Just were sent. Didn't they come over a month ago?" James flushed. "I know I haven't had a chance to do much reading to you in the last few weeks, Maggie, or any at all, in fact. But I've been so busy. After the baby's born, things will be much less hectic, and we'll be able to catch up." "Of course, James, I understand. Naturally, your family comes first. One of the books that came was an advanced zoology text that might make things a little clearer." "I should very much like to hear it, when you have the time to spare, that is." "Tell you what," he said. "I'll get the book and read you the chapter on the reproductive system in mammals. Won't take more than an hour or so. If you're in a hurry, it can wait." "No," he told her. "This will make me feel a little less guilty about having neglected you." "Whereupon the umbilical cord is severed," he concluded, "and the human infant is ready to take its place in the world as a separate entity. Now do you understand, Magnolia?" "No," she said. "Where do the bees come in?" "I thought you were in such a hurry to get to base, James," Phyllis remarked sweetly from the doorway, wiping her reddening hands on a dish towel. "I am, dear." He slipped the book behind his back. It was possible that, in her present state of mind, induced, of course, by her delicate condition, Phyllis might misunderstand his motive in reading that particular chapter of that particular book to that particular tree. "I just stopped for a chat with Magnolia. She's agreed to be godmother to the baby." "How very nice of her. Earth government will be so pleased at such a fine example of rapport with the natives. You might even get a medal. Wouldn't that be nice, James?" She hurried on before he could speak. "You still haven't found any green leaf plants on the planet, have you? Have you looked everywhere? Have you looked hard?" "Haven't I told you time and time again, Miss Hot," the tree said, "that there aren't any? That there can't be any. It's impossible to synthesize chlorophyll from the light rays given off by our sun. Only cyanophyll. What do you want with a green leaf plant anyway?" Phyllis's voice broke. "I think I'd lose my mind if I was convinced that I'd never see a green leaf again. All this awful blue, blue, blue all the time, and the leaves never fall off, or if they do, there are new ones right away to take their place. They're always there, always blue." "Wherever blue," Magnolia explained. "Sorry, but that's the way it is." "Jim, I hate to hurt your feelings, but I just have to take down those curtains. The colors, I can't stand it." "Pregnant women sometimes get fanciful notions," James said to the tree. "It's part of the pregnancy syndrome. Try not to pay any attention." "Kindly don't explain me to a tree," Phyllis cried. "I have a right to prefer green, don't I?" "There is, as your proverb says, no accounting for strange tastes," the tree murmured. "However—" "We're going to have a formal christening," James interrupted for the sake of peace. "We thought we should, since ours will be the first baby born on the planet. Everybody on Elysium will come. That is, all the human beings. Only because they can come, you know. We'd love to have the trees if they were capable of locomotor movement. You'll get to widen your social contacts, Maggie. Dr. Lakin and Dr. Cutler will probably be here. I know you'll be glad to see Dr. Lakin again. You've been anxious to meet Dr. Cutler. They've been asking after you, too. I think Dr. Lakin is planning to write a monograph on you for the Journal of American Association of Professors of English Literature. With your permission, of course." "Christening. That's one of your native festivals, isn't it? It should be most interesting." "That's right," Phyllis murmured. "It will be Christmas soon. I'd almost forgotten. It'll be the first Christmas I've ever spent away from home. And there won't be any snow or anything." She started to guttate, to cry again. "Cheer up, honey," Jim said. "It won't be as bad as you think, because I didn't forget Christmas was coming. There's something specially nice for you on its way from Earth. I only hope it gets here on time." Phyllis sniffled. "Maybe we'll have a Christmas party, too. Would you like that?" But she remained unresponsive. He turned to the tree. "Christening's entirely different, though," he explained. I guess naming the fruit would be the best way to describe it." "Is that so?" Magnolia said. "What kind of fruit do you expect to have, Mrs. Hot? Oranges? Bananas? As your good St. Luke says, the tree is known by its fruit. You look as if yours might be a watermelon." "Why, the idea!" Phyllis choked. "Are you going to stand there, James, and let that vegetable insult me?" "I'm sure she didn't mean to," he protested. "She got all confused by that zoology book I read her." The door slammed behind his weeping wife. "I don't think you quite understand, Maggie," he said. "In fact, sometimes I almost think you, too, don't want to understand." "I know what kind of fruit it's going to be," the tree concluded triumphantly. "Sour apples." "Ouch!" exclaimed Magnolia. "That tickles." "There's more to acting as a Christmas tree than I had anticipated from your glowing descriptions, Jim." "Here, dear," Phyllis said. "Maybe you'd better let me put the decorations on her." "You can't get on the ladder in your condition," he said, apprehensive. not only for her welfare, but for the trees. Phyllis had not taken kindly to the idea of having Magnolia as official Christmas tree, suggesting that if she must participate in the ceremonies, it might be better in the capacity of Yule log. However, Jim knew Magnolia would be offended if any other tree were chosen to be decorated. "I'll manage all right," he assured his wife. "If you want to be useful, you might put on some coffee and make sandwiches or something. The bachelors are coming over from base with that equipment that arrived yesterday, and they'll probably be glad of a snack before turning in."
"The coffee is already on, and the canapes made," Phyllis smiled. "And I've baked cookies, too, and whipped up a bunch of panuche. What kind of Christmas party do you think it would be without refreshments?"
"Very efficient, isn't she?" Magnolia remarked as the battery-powered lights that James had affixed to her began to wink on. For the deep red-violet dusk had already fallen, and the first moon was rising. "Have you thought, Mrs. Hott, that if you fruit today, it will save the expense of another festival?"
"I don't expect to fruit for another 2 months," Phyllis said coldly. "And why shouldn't we have another festival? We can afford it, and I like parties. I haven't been to one since the day I landed."
"Is the life out here getting a little quiet for you, Petiole?" the tree asked solicitously. "It must be hard when one has no intellectual resources upon which to draw." Phyllis held her peace for 10 seconds. Then,
"I wonder where those boys can be," she said. "I hope they bring some pickles along. I've asked to have some sent, but I'm accustomed to having no attention paid to what I want."
"There's a surprise coming for you, Phyllis." James could not help telling her again, hoping to arouse some semblance of interest. "Something I know you'll love, and for you, too," he said courteously to Magnolia. "You mean the same surprise for both? Or a surprise apiece?" the tree asked. "Oh, one for each, of course."
"I see the lights on the copter now,"
and running out into the middle of the lawn began waving her handkerchief. He hadn't seen her so pleasantly excited for a long time.
"I don't suppose I'll need to turn on the landing lights," he said to Magnolia. "You should do the trick."
"Am I all finished?" she rustled anxiously. "I do wish I could see myself. How do I look?"
"Splendid. I've never had as beautiful a Christmas tree as you, Maggie," he told her with complete honesty. "Not even on Earth."
"I'm glad, Jim, but I still wish I could be more to you than just a Christmas tree."
"Shh, the others might hear."
For the helicopter had landed, and the visitors were pouring out with shouts of admiration. Not only the bachelors had come, and in full force, but some of the older men from base, who apparently felt they could manage to do without their wives for 12 hours, even if those hours included Christmas Eve. He wondered where he and Phyllis could put them all, but some could sleep outside, if need be, for it was never cold on Elysium. The winds were gentle, and the rains light and fragrant. While the visitors were crowding around Phyllis and the tree, James rooted eagerly through the packages they had brought, until he found what he wanted. Then he rushed over to the group.
"I know I should wait until tomorrow, but I wanted to give the girls their presents now."
The other men smiled sympathetically, almost as joyful as he.
"Merry Christmas, Magnolia."
He hoped Phyllis would understand that it was etiquette which dictated that the alien life form should get her gift first. "Thank you," the tree said. "I am deeply touched. I don't believe anyone ever gave me a present before. What is it?"
"Liquid plant food, vitamins and minerals, you know, for you to drink."
"What fun!" she exclaimed in pretty excitement. "Pour some over me right now."
"Not so fast, Jim boy."
Dr. Cutler, the biologist, snatched the jug from James's hand. "First you all better let me take a sample of this here stuff back to the base to test on a lower life form, so's I can make sure it won't do anything bad to Miss Magnolia. Might have iron in it, and I have a theory that iron might not be beneficial for the local vegetation."
"Oh, thank you," the tree rustled. "It's so very thoughtful of you, Doctor, but I'm sure Jim would never give me anything that would injure me."
"I'm sure he isn't fixing to do a thing like that, ma'am, but he's no botanist."
"And for you, Phyllis?"
James handed his wife the awkward bundle to unwrap for herself. She tore the papers off slowly.
"Oh, Jim, darling, it's...
"You wanted a bit of green, so I ordered a plant from Earth. You like it? I hope you do."
Oh, Jim! She embraced him and the pot simultaneously. More than anything.
It won't stay green, Magnolia observed. Either it'll turn blue or it'll die. Puny-looking specimen, isn't it? Well, said James, it's only a youngster. I guess this Christmas is too early, but next Christmas there ought to be berries. It's a holly plant, Phil.
Holly, she repeated, her voice shaking a little. Holly. She and Dr. Cutler exchanged glances.
I told you, Miss Phyllis, ma'am. He may know the first thing about botany, but he doesn't know anything after that.
Jim, Phyllis said, linking her free arm through his, I misjudged you. Dr. Cutler is right. You don't know so very much about botany after all. He looked at her blankly. Her voice was trembling, and not with tears this time. I love this little plant. It's just what I wanted. But there aren't ever going to be any berries, because to have berries, you have to have two plants. And the right two. Hollies it's just like us.
Oh, James said, feeling thoroughly inadequate. I'm sorry.
But you mustn't be sorry. I'm going to plant it here on Elysium. And I hope it will stay green in spite of what she says. And it'll have blossoms anyway. And it was very, very sweet of you, dear. She kissed his cheek.
Is this one a boy or a girl? Magnolia asked.
You all can't tell till it blooms, Miss Magnolia, ma'am, Dr. Cutler informed her.
Maybe I can. Hand it up here, please.
Phyllis paused for an irresolute moment, then, smiling nervously at her guest, obliged.
It's a boy,
Magnolia announced after a minute.
A boy.
She gave back the pot reluctantly.
Phyllis, she said, you and I have never been friends, and I admit that it's been my fault just as much as yours.
As much as mine, Phyllis echoed. I like that.
She was going to go on, when she obviously recollected that they had company, and stopped. So, I know it's presumptuous of me to ask you a favor.
Yes, Magnolia, Phyllis said, her fine cornsilk eyebrows arched a trifle. What is this favor?
When you plant the little fellow, you said you were going to anyhow. Would you plant him near me?
Phyllis looked down at the plant she held cradled in her arms and then up at the tree. Of course, Magnolia, she said, frowning slightly. I didn't realize. Her voice began to tremble. I have been pretty rotten, haven't I? She looked toward James, but he turned his glance away. Just because you were a plant, Phyllis continued, didn't mean I had to be a beast. It must have been awful for you seeing me like this. Practically crowing over you and knowing that you yourself would never have the chance to be a mother.
Full many a flower is born to blush unseen, Magnolia said sadly, and waste its sweetness on the desert air.
Phyllis was crying unshamedly now. I'll plant him right next to you, Maggie. I want you to have him. He can be your baby.
Thank you, Phil, Maggie said softly. That's very blue of you.
Although I think it's a Jim Dandy idea, Biologist said, and I sure wouldn't want to do anything to discourage it. Being real interested in the results of an experiment like that my own self, I don't think you ought to feel so mean about it, Miss Phyllis. If all she wanted, begging your pardon, Miss Magnolia, ma'am, was a baby, why didn't she take an interest in the holly until she found out it was a male? Why wouldn't a little old girl holly have done as well? Why, you scheming vegetable! Phyllis exploded at Magnolia, clutching the holly plant to her protective bosom. He's much too young for you, and I'm going to plant him far away, where he can't possibly fall into your clutches. Now, Miss Phyllis, we all mustn't look at things out of their proper perspective. Then why do you take your hat off when you are introduced to Miss Magnolia, Cutler? Dr. Lakin asked interestedly. Sir, where I come from, we respect femininity, whether it be animal, vegetable, or mineral. Nonetheless, we all got to remember, though Miss Magnolia is unquestionably a lady, she is not a woman. Phyllis began to laugh hysterically. You're right. I had almost forgotten. She was only a tree, and that it is only a little Christmas holly plant that's probably going to die anyway. They almost always do. That's cruel, Phyllis, James said, and you know it is. Do you really think I'm cruel? Are you going to tell the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Vegetables on me? Why am I cruel? I'm giving her the holly. That's what she wants, isn't it? Do you hear that, Miss Magnolia, ma'am? He's all yours. We'll plant him next to you right away. And I hope he doesn't die. I hope he grows up to make you a good husband."
"She's really quite remarkable," Dr. Lakin said to James later that same evening, after the planting ceremonies were over, and the rest of the party had gone to the cottage for fresh coffee and more sandwiches and cookies and penuche. "Quite remarkable. You're a lucky man, Hot." "Thank you, sir," James replied abstractedly. "I'm sure Phyllis will be pleased to—" "Phyllis? Oh, Mrs. Hot is a very remarkable woman, of course. A handsome, strong girl. She'll make a splendid mother, I'm sure. But I was referring to Miss Magnolia. She's a credit to you, my boy. If for no other reason, your name will go down in the history of our colony as that of the guide and mentor of Miss Magnolia. That's quite a tree you have there."
James looked at the dark form of the tree, for the lights had been turned out, silhouetted against the 3 pale moons and the violet night.
"Yes, she is," he said. "You're fortunate to be her neighbor and her friend." "Yes, I am. Well, I expect I better join the rest. Are you coming on in, Jim?" "In a little while, sir. I wanted to have a word with Magnolia. I won't be long." Of course. I'm delighted to see that there is such an excellent relationship between you. Good night." "Good night, Miss Magnolia," he called.
"Good night, Dr. Lakin," the tree replied, politely enough, but it was obvious that she was preoccupied with her new charge, who stood as close to her as it was possible to plant him and yet allow room for him to grow. The door closed. James walked across the lawn until he was quite near Magnolia. "Maggie," he whispered, reaching out to touch her trunk. Smooth it was, and hard, but he could feel the vibrant life pulsing inside it. Certainly she was not a plant, not just a plant, even though she was a tree. She was a native of Elysium, neither animal nor vegetable. Unique unto the planet, unique unto herself.
"Maggie?"
"Yes, Jim. Don't you think his silhouette is so graceful there in the moonlight?
He isn't really puny, just frail."
"Maggie, you're not serious about this holly."
"What do you mean?"
And still he didn't have her full attention. Would he ever have it again?
"Serious about raising him to be your...
Why not, Jim?"
"It's impossible."
"Is it? It certainly is far more possible with him, isn't it? That much I understood from your zoology books."
"I suppose so."
"Besides, I have nothing to lose, have I?"
"But even if it were possible, wouldn't it be humiliating for you? The creature is mindless."
Magnolia's leaves rustled in the darkness. She was laughing, a little bitterly.
"Your Phyllis isn't your intellectual equal, Jim, and yet you say you love her, and I suppose you do.
Am I not entitled to my follies also?" But she couldn't compare Phyllis to a holly plant. It was unreasonable.
"He may die, of course," Magnolia said. "I've got to be prepared for that. The soil is different, the air is different, the sun is different.
But the chances are, if he survives, he'll turn blue, and if he turns blue, who knows what other changes might be brought about? Maybe the plants on your earth aren't inherently mindless, Jim. Maybe they just didn't have a chance. Know ye the land where the cypress and myrtle are emblems of deeds that are done in their clime? That land isn't Earth, Jim, so it might just possibly be Elysium." Again, he didn't say anything. What he wanted to say, he had no right to say, so he just kept silent.
"It'll be a chance for me too, Jim. At least we're both plants, he and I. That gives us a head start." "Yes, I suppose it does."
Intellect doesn't count for much in the propagation of the species. Life goes on without regard for reason, and that's mainly what we're here for, to make sure that life goes on. And if we're here for anything at all, thanks to your kind, Jim, life will continue on this planet, and it will certainly be your kind of life, and I hope it can be ours as well."
"Yes," he said. "I hope so too."
And he did. But he wished it didn't have to continue in quite that way. Perhaps it was a trick of the 3 moons, but the holly plant's leaves seemed to have changed color. They were no longer green, but almost blue, powder blue.
You'd best be getting on to your party, Jim, Magnolia said. You wouldn't want to be remiss in your duties as host. And please, close the door gently when you go inside. The little holly plant's asleep.
As he closed the door carefully behind him, he heard a burst of laughter coming from the kitchen, where the guests apparently had assembled. Raucous animal laughter, and, rising shrill and noisy above it, Phyllis's company laugh.
Recording by Peter Eastman. Zaritsky's Law by Anne Griffith. Somebody, someday, will make a study of the influence of animals on history. Although not as famous as Mrs. O'Leary's cow, Mrs. Graham's cat should certainly be included in any such study. It has now been definitely established that the experiences of this cat led to the idea of quick frozen people, which in turn led to the passage of Zaritsky's Law. We must go back to the files of the Los Angeles newspapers for 1950 to find the story. In brief, Mrs. Fred C. Graham missed her pet cat on the same day that she put a good deal of food down in her home deep freeze unit. She suspected no connection between the two events. The cat was not to be found until 6 days later, when its owner went to fetch something from the deep freeze. Much as she loved her pet, we may imagine that she was more horror than grief-stricken at her discovery. She lifted the little ice-encased body out of the deep freeze and set it on the floor. Then she managed to run as far as the next-door neighbor's house before fainting. Mrs. Graham became hysterical after she was revived, and it was several hours before she could be quieted enough to persuade anybody that she hadn't made up the whole thing. She prevailed upon her neighbor to go back to the house with her. In front of the deep freeze, they found a small pool of water and a wet cat busily licking itself. The neighbor subsequently told reporters that the cat was concentrating its licking on one of its hind legs where some ice still remained, so that she, for one, believed the story. A follow-up dispatch, published a week later, reported that the cat was unharmed by the adventure. Further, Mrs. Graham was quoted as saying that the cat had had a large meal just before its disappearance, that as soon after its rescue as it had dried itself off, it took a long nap, precisely as it always did after a meal, and that it was not hungry again until evening. It was clear from the accounts that the life processes had been stopped dead in their tracks, and had, after defrosting, resumed at exactly the point where they left off. Perhaps it is unfair to put all the responsibility on one luckless cat. Had such a thing happened anywhere else in the country, it would have been talked about, believed by a few, disbelieved by most, and forgotten. But as the historic kick of Mrs. O'Leary's cow achieved significance because of the time and place that it was delivered, so the falling of Mrs. Graham's cat into the deep freeze became significant because it occurred in Los Angeles. There, and probably only there, the event was anything but forgotten. The principles it revealed became the basis of a hugely successful business. How shall we regard the Zaritsky brothers? As arch-villains or pioneers? In support of the latter view, it must be admitted that the spirit of inquiry and the willingness to risk the unknown were indisputably theirs. However, their pioneering, if we agree to call it that, was equally indisputably bound up with the quest for a fast buck. Some of their first clients paid as high as $15,000 for the initial freezing, and the exorbitant rate of $1,000 per year as a storage charge. The Zaritsky brothers owned and managed one of the largest quick freezing plants in the world, and it was their claim that converting the freezing equipment and storage facilities to accommodate humans was extremely expensive, hence the high rates. When the early clients who paid these rates were defrosted years later, and found other clients receiving the same services for as little as $3,000, they threatened a row, and the Zaritsky's made substantial refunds. By that time, they could easily afford it, and since any publicity about their enterprise was unwelcome to them, all refunds were made without a whimper. $3,000 became the standard rate, with $100 per year the storage charge, and no charge for defrosting. The Zaritsky's were businessmen first and last. Anyone who had the fee could put himself away for whatever period of time he wished, and no questions asked. The ironclad rule that full payment must be made in advance was broken only once, as far as the records show. A certain young man had a very wealthy uncle residing in Milwaukee, whose heir he was, but the uncle was not getting along in years fast enough. The young man, then 18 years old, did not wish to waste the best years of his life as a poor boy. He wanted the money while he was young, but his uncle was as healthy as he was wealthy. The Zaritsky's were the obvious answer to his problem. The agreement between them has been preserved. They undertook to service the youth without advance payment. They further undertook to watch the Milwaukee papers until the demise of the uncle should be reported, whereupon they would defrost the boy. In exchange for this, the youth, thinking of course that money would be no object when he came out, agreed to pay double. The uncle lived 17 years longer, during which time he seems to have forgotten his nephew, and to have become deeply interested in a mystic society to which he left his entire fortune. The Zaritsky's duly defrosted the boy, and whether they or he were the more disappointed is impossible to imagine. They never forgot the lesson, and never made another exception to their rule. He, poor fellow, spent the rest of his life, including the best years, paying off his debt, which at $3,000 plus 17 years at $100 per year and the whole doubled, amounted to $9,400. The books record his slow but regular payments over the next 43 years, and indicate that he had only $250 left to pay when he died. We may, I think, assume that various underworld characters who were grateful ex-clients of the Zaritsky's were instrumental in persuading the boy to keep up his payments. Criminals were the first to apply for quick freezing, and formed the mainstay of the Zaritsky's business through the years. What more easy than to rob, hide the loot, except for that all-important advance payment, present yourself to the Zaritsky's, and remain in their admirable chambers for 5 or 10 years, emerge to find the hue and cry long since died down and the crime forgotten, recover your haul, and live out your life in luxury. Due to the shady character of most of their patrons, the Zaritsky's kept all records by a system of numbers. Names never appeared on the books, and anonymity was guaranteed. Law enforcement agents, looking for fugitives from justice, found no way to break down this system, nor any law which they could interpret as making it illegal to quick freeze. Perhaps the truth is that they did not search too diligently for a law that could be made to apply. As long as the Zaritsky's kept things quiet and did not advertise or attract public attention, they could safely continue their bizarre business. City officials of Los Angeles, and particularly members of the police force, enjoyed a period of unparalleled prosperity. Lawyers and other experts who thought they were on the track of legal means by which to liquidate the Zaritsky empire found themselves suddenly able to buy a ranch or a yacht or both, and retire forever from the arduous task of earning a living. Even with a goodly part of the population of Los Angeles as permanent pensioners, the Zaritsky fortune grew to incredible proportions. By the time the Zaritsky brothers died and left the business to their sons, it was a gold mine, and an inexhaustible one at that. During these later years, the enterprise began to attract a somewhat better class of people. Murderers and other criminals continued to furnish the bulk of the business, but as word of this amazing service seeped through the country, others began to see in it an easy way of solving their problems. They were encouraged, too, by the fact that the process was painless and the firm completely reliable. There were no risks, no accidents, no fatalities. One could, in short, have confidence in the Zaritskys. Soon after Monahan's great exposure rocked the nation, however, many of these better-type clients leaped into print to tell their experiences. One of the most poignant stories came from the daughter of a Zaritsky client. Her father was still, at the age of 102, passionately interested in politics, but the chances of his lasting until the next election were not good. The daughter herself suggested the deep freeze, and he welcomed the idea. He decided on a 20-year stay because, in his own words, "If the Republicans can't get into the White House in 20 years, I give up." Upon his return, he found that his condition had not been fulfilled. His daughter described him as utterly baffled by the new world. He lived in it just a week before he left it, this time for good. She states his last words were, "How do you people stand it?" Some professional people patronized the Zaritskys, chiefly movie stars. After the expose, fan magazines were filled with accounts of how the stars had kept youthful. The more zealous ones had prolonged their screen lives for years by the simple expedient of storing themselves away between pictures. We may imagine the feelings of their public upon discovering that the seemingly eternal youth of their favorites was due to the Zaritskys, and not, as they had been led to believe, to expensive creams, lotions, diet, and exercise. There was a distinctly unfavorable reaction, and the letter columns of the fan magazines bristled with angry charges of cheating. But next to criminals, the majority of people who applied for quick freezing seems to have been husbands or wives caught in insupportable marital situations. Their experiences were subsequently written up in the confession magazines. It was usually the husband who fled to Los Angeles and incarcerated himself for an appropriate number of years, at the end of which time his unamiable spouse would have died or made other arrangements. If we can believe the magazines, this scheme worked out very well in most cases. There was, inevitably, one spiteful wife who divined her husband's intentions. By shrewd reasoning, she figured approximately the number of years he had chosen to be absent, and put herself away for a like period. In a TV dramatization rather pessimistically entitled, "You Can't Get Away," the husband described his sensations upon being defrosted after 15 years, only to find his wife waiting for him right there in the reception room of the Zaritsky plant. "She was as perfectly preserved as I was," he said. "Every irritating habit that had made my life unbearable with her was absolutely intact." The sins of the fathers may be visited on the sons, but how often we see repeated the old familiar pattern of the sons destroying the life work of the fathers. The Zaritsky brothers were fanatically meticulous. They supervised every detail of their operations and kept their records with an elaborate system of checks and double checks. They were shrewd enough to realize that complete dependability was essential to their business. A satisfied Zaritsky client was a silent client. One dissatisfied client would be enough to blow the business apart. The sons, in their greed, overexpanded to the point where they could not, even among the 4 of them, personally supervise each and every detail. A fatal mistake was bound to occur sooner or later. When it did, the victim broadcast his grievance to the world. The story appeared in a national magazine, every copy of which was sold an hour after it appeared on the stands. Under the title, "They Put the Freeze on Me," John A. Monahan told his tragic tale. At the age of 37, he had fallen desperately in love with a girl of 16. She was immature and frivolous and wanted to play around a little more before she settled down. "She told me," he wrote, "to come back in 5 years, and that started me thinking. In 5 years I'd be 42, and what would a girl of 21 want with a man twice as old as her?" John Monahan moved in circles where the work of the Zaritskys was well known. Not only did he see an opportunity of being still only 37 when his darling reached 21, but he foresaw a painless way of passing the years which he must endure without her. Accordingly, he presented himself for the deep freeze, paid his $3,000 and the $500 storage charge in advance, and left, he claimed, written instructions to let me out in 5 years so there'd be no mistakes. Nobody knows how the slip happened, but somehow John A. Monahan, or rather the number assigned to him, was entered on the books for 25 years instead of 5 years. Upon being defrosted and discovering that a quarter of a century had elapsed, his rage was awesome. Along with everything else, his love for his sweetheart had been perfectly preserved, but she had given up waiting for him, and was a happy mother of 2 boys and 6 girls. Monahan's accusation that the Zaritskys had ruined his life may be taken with a grain of salt. He was still a young man, and the rumor that he received $100,000 for the magazine rights to his story was true. As most readers are aware, what has come to be known as Zaritsky's Law was passed by Congress and signed by the President 3 days after Monahan's story broke. 75 years after Mrs. Graham's cat fell into the freezer, it became the law of the land that the mandatory penalty for anyone applying quick freezing methods to any living thing, human or animal, was death. Also, all quick frozen people were to be defrosted immediately. Los Angeles papers reported that beginning on the day Monahan's story appeared, men by the thousands poured into the city. They continued to come, choking every available means of transport for the next 2 days. Until, that is, Zaritsky's Law went through. When we consider the date, and remember that due to the gravity of the international situation, a bill had just been passed drafting all men from 16 to 60, we realize why Congress had to act. The Zaritskys, of course, were among the first to be taken. Because of their experience, they were put in charge of a military warehouse for dehydrated foods, and warned not to get any ideas for a new business.